I'd like to call to order this continuation of the May 18th Planning Board public hearing regarding the 1440 Pine site and related parcels. This is May 30th, 2017. And on May 18th, we completed the public hearing for this matter and then deferred consideration by the board. So tonight, we will be considering this application, and just for the benefit of both the audience and the board, I'd like to suggest that we start with making disclosures again, just to confirm that folks have complied with the requirements of quasi-judicial hearings. We'll go back over that, but we'll look to the board to indicate whether they've had any additional ex parte contacts or communications since the original hearing on the 18th. Then we'll move on to board questions of staff only. Given that we've closed public hearing and we've had a chance to ask questions of the applicant, I would strongly encourage us not to reach out to the applicant until maybe a time when we're crafting conditions, if it's the pleasure of the board to move in that direction. But let's start out just with any additional cleanup questions with staff. Then we'll move on to board deliberation and discussion. And would like to just start with, similar to what we did at our last meeting, kind of initial check-in with everybody about how they're feeling about the application overall, whether they think it's overall approvable, not approvable, and places where they'd like to have additional discussion, including on the 4 separate use review items that we have tonight. And then after that, we'll go in detail through the site review application, through the 4 use review applications, and then finally have a motion from the board to dispose of this matter one way or the other. Just as a reminder, this is a quasi-judicial matter, so we can only consider the items that we heard in the public hearing, the packet that we had received, and then the materials we had received from the public as of the night of the hearing. As a result, we have not considered emails, communications, newspaper articles, other sort of things that have happened in the last week and a half. So I'll start with disclosures. That while I have received many emails on this subject, I did not read those emails. I did not read articles in the paper, and the only communications that I've had on this subject were answering factual questions about when tonight's deliberation session would occur and at what time that would be. So with that, maybe start with Peter and work our way down.
Similarly, received emails, did not read them, did not read the newspaper articles.
Right, thank you. Brian?
Great. I'm going to make bigger disclosures just because I need to get through the stuff that I didn't have a chance to say last half of the hearing. So I'm familiar with the site as a Boulder resident, and I also made specific site visits in the context of this process. I did participate in the concept review at Planning Board and in subsequent DAB reviews as ex officio member. And just so everybody knows, when any of us sits on a board as an ex officio member, those reviews are really limited to the scope of that board. They're not part of the site review or use review kind of processes, and they're not part of the same criteria. And since I wasn't able to attend the first half of this meeting, I did watch the whole thing online. And it turns out you can watch it while running on a treadmill. It's good. We should get some treadmills for up here. And I have also read all the emails in the packet that were available prior to that meeting, and have not read any of the emails that came out since then, nor read any camera articles or anything like that. So,
Great, thank you, Brian. Harmon?
Okay, well, I think the treadmill idea is great. It would probably limit board comment a lot if we were running out of breath.
we're breathless, yeah.
I have, just to be clear, when we said we've not read any of the emails, we meant the emails since the 18th. I think everybody said we had read all of the emails that came in up to the original hearing. So like the others, I have received emails that I have not opened or read since the 18th, since the public comment was closed. I'm not aware of any newspaper articles, didn't read any newspaper articles, but I was unable to avoid hearing NPR's short blurb on the hearing that we're having tonight this morning at 6 when my alarm went off, so I heard that.
Thank you, Harmon. Liz?
So I have not, I received a lot of the emails, and you can get some of the content from the subject line and then realize, okay, you can't open that. But I didn't open it or read any of the emails. And I didn't even open or read the emails from the applicant. So I don't know if we were supposed to or not, but I just didn't. So, and then same with, any newspaper articles or any other. I haven't had any kind of contact or ex parte contacts at all.
Great. Thank you, Crystal.
I am in a similar situation. I received not a lot, but 7 or 8 emails. I don't know if you guys received more, but I didn't open the 2 from the applicant. Shannon Cox Baker sent us a couple. And sometimes they open as I'm just scrolling through, so I just went on to the next one and didn't read the newspaper articles. That I only saw 2 that would be pertinent, and didn't read any of the other emails. I did, on a walk with my dog, notice that there were not any parking permit signs on the south side of Pine Street between 15th and 14th Street. So that is something that I did notice that's new.
Great. Thank you, Crystal. David?
Okay, well, I have also not read any of the emails that have come in. I did re-review the packet that we had before us last week. I did also walk by the site during the festivities of the weekend, but I didn't learn anything new in passing the site. I just walked by it, and I guess that's about it.
Great. And as we move forward tonight, just to let all of you know, we've had no communications with each other either, because that would be inappropriate. All of our discussion will happen here in the open tonight. And similarly, we won't be reading emails, texts, anything else like that that will come in tonight. Everything has to be on the record and out in the open. So with that, any additional thoughts from staff before we move into questions from the board? Great. Are there any clarifying questions from the board? Anything that's been burning on your mind the last 10 days or so? Okay. David?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. There is a little bit of a difference between the proposal, from the Attention Homes proposal and the conditions with regards to how parking spaces will be signed. In the shared parking proposal in the parking plan, it indicated that only a subset of the spaces would be signed, and then the rest would be kind of on a first-come, first-served basis. But then in the conditions, I think it's condition number 13, it actually says pretty much every space will be signed. So I just wondered if we could get a quick response as to why that might be preferred.
The applicant's consultant basically was arguing that there could be managed parking out there and only have signed parking for like the church spaces. City staff was in disagreement with that. We felt that in order to ensure that there was proper allocation of spaces out there, that there should be specific signs for specific uses. I mean, they'll be up, their management company would manage those spaces, but we felt that there should be a minimum number for each of the uses. So that's why we put that as a condition of approval. And to our knowledge, the applicant hasn't disputed that condition.
Okay, and I don't know if we know whether the existing tenants have assumed that their spaces will be signed, but I assume that will be easier for them because they'll know that they're there for them.
Right.
Great. Peter?
I have a question that might fit in now because I'm not sure it's part of our deliberation later. A lot of comments were about the timing, the applicant's timing of seeking the allocation of tax credits before any other process had been started. And I'm curious if we're able to get any information on, is that standard and something that we're It doesn't feel right to me at all, and I'm not sure what part of this deliberation it goes to, but if that's standard practice, that's one thing. If it isn't, it's something I'd like to know.
Come on down.
Good evening. Kurt Fernhauer, Deputy Director of Housing. So I'll shed a little bit of light on that. So one of the challenges with this project is the success they've had in their 9% tax credit award. And typically those types of projects have to apply multiple times before they get it. It's unusual for them to get it the first time. So when they did receive it, it did sort of put a particular schedule in front of them. So sometime this fall, they would probably have to pull building permits in order to stay on track with the funding requirements. So it does put some additional pressure on the project that normally wouldn't be there. And because 9% tax credits are extremely competitive, it plays into that as well. But there is a timing constraint around the project from our funding standpoint.
Would it be normal for an applicant to go after this allocation, not receive it, and in the meantime, move forward at their own expense on the project and have that at risk?
Yes, that it can happen that way. I think typically they would do it along the way, as they have done, because there is quite a bit of expense in putting a project like this together. And there's a lot of, that money is at risk when they do that. And so trying to get some of the funding in place as the project goes along is not atypical either.
One last question. When they did apply for these funds based on these criteria, was that criteria devised in relationship with what they expected us to approve as a community? Was there any communication as in, we're going to apply for this at this site, here's the research we're going to do, and talk to the community and find out if this is okay? Because they would have known full well, it's their business to know that if once they're approved, there's not a lot of wiggle room.
That's correct. I believe there was some engagement with the community before they started that process. I don't know how many meetings they had, but there was some engagement with the community before their application.
Those seem to have been the only meetings that would have mattered.
I'm sorry?
Those seem to have been the only meetings that would have mattered then, because once the allocation was made, this is the path.
That's correct,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
Yep.
Kurt, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Was that January 1st deadline of 2016 that they applied for the low-income housing tax credits?
I don't know the date that they actually applied. Yeah, June of last year.
June of last year.
Yeah.
So then the planning board meeting to hear our comments for concept review was July 14th. And the public also made comments at that meeting.
Right.
I believe. And so then my next question, I'll just wait to see if Peter's done, but I wanted to ask Carl what changes they might have made based on our input.
Peter,
I'm done.
Okay. So any other questions for Kurt while he's up?
Yeah, the only thing I'll clarify is there's certain time periods when you can make the application.
Yeah.
You can't make it at any time of the year.
Yeah, I know the planning board had a joint study session with city council on this topic on January 10th, and I actually wasn't able to attend, but I watched it live. So I thought Jeremy from Boulder Housing Partners covered that schedule very clearly, yeah.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Crystal, do you want to address maybe repeat your questions?
Yeah.
The board has it, or the staff has it?
So I got out the minutes. They were, linked in our packet to July 14th minutes on the concept review. And the applicant did change a number of things. They changed based on some DDEB input, I think some neighborhood input, and the planning board by taking that third story, pushing it more interior into the building, and changing some materials, things like that. But one thing that I just wanted to read here, it said from our minutes, and this was the board's summary. With respect to the proposed uses, the board had mixed opinions, but overall felt that sacrifice of some of the proposed administrative and office space on the first floor may need to be done to keep the living space that is being requested, and that had to do with the mass and scale of the building. It was suggested to relocate the proposed retail space to a point along the alley on the west side. In regard to the height, if sufficient setback from the street exists, perhaps removing the third floor from 15th Street, et cetera, et cetera. So I just was wondering if any of the administrative support space for attention homes was changed, the square footage to help reduce the mass and scale, or if some alternatives to the restaurant were looked at.
I don't know that they made significant changes to the square footage of the office space. I think they did reduce it in order to enable the restaurant space to be enlarged to allow for the kitchen on the corner. Originally, the corner space was about 800 square feet, and then to make it an operating kitchen, they took some of that space away from the office use. But I think we had suggested a number of things, looking at the common areas, making those maybe a little bit smaller in order to reduce the mass. We were just proposing ways of shifting the massing. They were able to achieve the reduced massing of the building by, shifting that square footage away from the streetscapes. So
And was the common space reduced?
I don't think that they reduced it significantly, to my knowledge. I don't remember the exact number of square footage at the concept plan.
And then I just had a couple of other questions. So is the project, people had testified that it was so great that the church gave the attention homes the land. But is it your understanding that the lease from with the church is with Gardner Development, and then they have a sublease with Attention Homes, or is the master lease with Attention Homes?
I think I might have to defer to the applicant about that.
Actually, before we do that, is that a factor that we can consider under the site review criteria?
No, I don't know where that would come in.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. But if it's not a site review criteria, that's fine. Just one other thing is, at 1175 Lee Hill, I know that they have a good neighbor policy, but looking through the packet, there's a good neighbor policy or a management plan for the restaurant. But are they required in our site review criteria for transitional housing to have any type of good neighbor policy? I know that they mentioned an operations working group, but where would that come into our approval?
There is no requirement in the transitional housing regs for a good neighbor meeting. I think they opted to have the operations working group, as a way to communicate with neighbors outside of the city requirements.
But there's no requirement to have a management plan for transitional housing?
There is not.
Okay, was that just an option for 1175 Lee Hill?
I think it must have been. I mean, it's not part of the requirements.
Okay. Let's see. Just one other question on the density. So I read the email, I reread it, that you sent in response to a question I had. I believe it was May 17th. And I think it was posted to the internet. But I tried to chase down all your citations, and it revolves around the density calculations. And going back to how can you calculate that there's density when on the full site, when there is a totally built-out structure, and I'm talking about the church. And so it's totally built out, it's landmarked, it has no density to be transferred from that. So I read and I think it would have been more helpful if you had looked at the vacant lots or the vacant areas and then calculated what density on those open parts could be transferred. Now, I would assume that the existing Attention Homes house or office building, you could actually foresee 4 little units on that site that you could transfer. Or when I was looking at some of the citations, I think 9-8-3B allows the planning board to even double that, the density, or by reducing the size of the lot that's required for density. But I'm just saying there's been, before our meeting on the 18th, we had received a number of emails on density transfer, and people couldn't find it in the code, and there were a lot of questions. I think that they could probably get to a density, I was kind of fooling around, of like 34 units. You might even be able to get up to 40, but it would be much more defensible and clearer if that was described by a diagram or on the site plan somehow. Rather than just say, because last time we had this discussion at the 18th meeting, there's nothing in the citation that says you can, in the code that says you can transfer density, and there's nothing, Hella said, that prevents you from doing that.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even necessarily call it a density transfer. I think that's how the public has been referring to it. I think it's more a matter of code interpretation and how the code sections are applied. And what in this particular zoning district, the density is calculated based on the lot area per dwelling unit.
Right.
And in site review, it's looked at based on the entire site that it is in site review. And the site review criteria, actually, Carl and I were looking at it today. In the first criterion, it does refer a little bit to density, and it only talks about the density of the site. So it looks at it as the entire site that's within the site review. So the historic interpretation and application of the density in that context is consistent with how the site review standards are written. I'm losing my train of thought here. But yeah, so it's based on the entire site. And on the church property, for example, there's a big building, but that area doesn't have any dwelling units. And this particular zoning district doesn't have any FAR limitations that looks at how much square footage is located and how much lot area. So in other zone districts, that might be an additional limitation that comes in, but here that doesn't exist. But even where floor area is an additional limitation, the density may be calculated like this. And I looked again today at another project that I think is comparable that some of you acted on, and that's the Trinity Church project.
Right.
And if you remember, the Trinity Church had a church on a lot that was south of an alley, and then on the north side of an alley was a large parking lot, and that consisted of several additional lots. And the church developed that lot with housing, parking, and part of that is going to be public parking where KJIT owns an interest in the property, and church office space and nonprofit use space. And for the residential units on the site, the density was also calculated based on the entire area that was part of the site review, and that were all the lots that were north of the alley, as well as the church side on the south of the alley. So this has been a consistent practice, and I find it to be consistent with how the code is written.
Well, and that property is actually in a different zone, in a transitional business zone, as is 1175 Lee Hill. So that was, yeah, I thought about that, but I thought that it's in an entirely different zone.
Yeah, and that zone district also has lot area per dwelling unit standards, and for that approval, there was actually a special ordinance that increased the allowed density beyond what was allowed based on this method of calculation, as well as allowing, I think, maybe almost twice as the floor area that would have been allowed under the code otherwise.
Yeah, and the interesting thing with that, just one more item, is they had an approval for actually a larger project, so what you saw built was scaled down quite a bit, and even though the adjacent neighborhoods didn't oppose the project in the transitional business, the scaled down project, people were, I know, pretty pleased to see that. But anyway, I'm just saying that I just think it would have been a little bit more transparent and helpful for me as I'm interpreting the code, which I feel is doesn't give much guidance on how you deal with the totally developed portion of the block, because they use block and lot interchangeably.
So let's save the kind
Yeah.
of analysis piece. And I guess just as a follow-up question for Hella, in order for the board as a whole or individual board members to approve this, we would need to, one, be comfortable with this interpretation of the code, and so we need to make a judgment on that, as well as to apply the site review criteria related to density and find that that also is appropriate. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, and the site review criteria go into the compatibility of the building size and height and massing and so forth with the existing character of the area. So I think there are a lot of review criteria that get at that concern on how much is on this side.
So I'd encourage everybody to specifically address that question, because I know it's an important question from the public, and one that I think we do need to wrestle with. So with that, any other clarifying questions, Harmon?
So when we look at residential projects that have 40 units, it's going to go to planning, it's going to go to site review, period, because it meets the number of unit threshold, whether they're ELUs or not. It's just units. But the first, so thank you for that. But the first bullet in our decision matrix is looking at section 983 density in these districts, including the RH2. Do we approve the proposed density? Do we really need to do that? Because by the calcs, it looks like you could have 28 units without planning board review, and if you apply the ELU, 1/2 unit per unit equivalent, you end up with 27.5, which is less than the threshold for site review. So I'm wondering why we even have to weigh in on density by the code.
Anything over 20 dwelling units automatically requires site review. So because the project, for a number of reasons, requires planning board review, that discretion lies with the planning board either way. We conservatively looked at it, not counting each unit through the ELU provision and just kind of saying it's 47 units total. So either way, it requires planning board, through that lens. We feel that, it has to come before the planning board. It's the planning board's discretion.
And just to follow up on it, to the extent it's in front of planning board under the site review regs and that requires us to consider density, we should address that, shouldn't we?
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to point out again, if you look at the language in 9.8.3, it allows planning board to reduce the minimum lot area from 3,000 to 1,600 square feet of lot area per unit. And I don't think that's really what we're here to decide, because if we apply our code, it's 27 and a half units and doesn't require us to reduce the minimum lot area below 3,000 square feet. So are we really just looking at it in terms of a site review because there are more than 20 units being proposed?
I would look at it as that particular, the doubling, or I guess it's not really doubling, but then the reducing of the amount of required open space can be approved in site review, and that would be based on whether or not the site review criteria are met. And I think it can only be approved by the planning board, because am I correct that that section references the planning board?
Yeah, and it's the same criteria either way. So we just felt,
Okay.
you know, you just apply the criteria. You have to decide on if the density, how they have it proposed, is appropriate or not. We just felt that it's the same criteria. There's no specific criteria that are in 983 that say you have to meet this in order to do this.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it, Carl.
Any last questions? Otherwise, why don't we start with really getting down to brass tacks and giving a sense for where people are overall with this project. Obviously, our conversation will be different if there seems to be more in favor or more opposed. So I'm just going to start down on your end, David, unless you want to take a pass as a new member, which is fine. And we'll come back to you, and then we'll just come down the board and give everybody a chance to provide some initial comments. Let's not go too long because we will get to the details, but at least provide a thumbnail sketch of where you're thinking big picture, either fatal flaw so you can approve it, or that you think overall it does approve, or you could only approve with conditions.
Just a clarification. So you want us to go down each one of these bullets, and then we're going to come back and discuss them? Or a general statement?
A general statement overall, and then we'll come back to the specifics because we do need to make sure we're hitting the big picture here, or the specific points of the site review and use review criteria. David?
All right, well, my feeling is going through this proposal that it's given me the opportunity to really reference the land use code with regards to the things that staff is recommending and really take a look. And from what I've seen, it looks like a lot of the legwork has been done. It seems to conform pretty well. The concern about the density transfer thing that's been coming up is something that, you know, I felt was answered pretty clearly by Hella last week, and also by just looking at the code. We just don't have anything other than to go by other than how site boundaries can be set. There is no such thing as density transfer in the code. So really the way the code works is you can set your site boundaries this way. So I think we just have to go for that. If we, you know, as a planning board, I think we have the opportunity over time to help influence the codes if we feel that they're inadequate to handle certain things. If we see that, you know, maybe we need to address this, we can do that in the future. But I think it would be unfair to create a criteria. So that's where I'm kind of at that at this point. And then I am also wrestling with the discrepancy between what is being asked for and what's being recommended in the conditions with regards to how many leased parking places there can be. I'd really love to actually say the 33 could be given, but to do that, I would feel like we would have to do away with signage and have everybody share all the spaces. And once you start assigning spaces, you kind of give preferential treatment to some of the tenants or some of the uses, and then you've started down that path. And so once you start to reserve those spaces, I feel like, well, then the number actually does come up being 22 that you can give to the least use. So I guess I would be interested in finding out what other board members think about possibly doing even more of a sump proposal where we actually don't do the signage. It's problematic because there are some spaces that are right there next to the properties. So I realize that's difficult. It would be hard to say, oh, well, that space right next to that house could be parking for a staff person over there. So maybe the answer is the 22. But I've been wrestling with it because it just philosophically, I think we would end up with less spillover into the neighborhood if we could share all those spaces because they'd fill up before you'd end up with spillover. Right now, if 6 spaces for business X fill up, then the 7th person is going to have to look out on the street.
And let's definitely come back to that issue in more detail and the parking reduction and then use review for the leasing of parking discussion.
Yeah.
Great. Crystal?
Just to start out, on the Boulder Valley Comp Plan compliance, I feel it does a good job of meeting certain parts of the comp plan, and that is providing for a diverse population and underserved populations, and especially addressing homelessness. But on the other hand, there's some areas where it doesn't meet, neighborhood compatibility and fitting in with the neighborhood. And then that goes to our site review criteria, which is the mass and scale and the density. I think they did a good job of changing the design of the building to make it more compatible rather than less compatible. I thought that was great. It brought down the mass a bit, and the scale and the it's not conformity, that's a special term in our lingo, but it brought down or it made it more in conformance with some of the existing architecture in the neighborhood. Some of the things that I've worried about and I expressed during the concept review was the restaurant injects a non-residential use right in that important corner, and I have concerns about that. We've got a mall with a lot of the same uses, and I even mentioned this at concept review, that possibly they could develop partnerships to have some of their residents trained on the site and then working in some of the restaurants downtown. I mean, 50% of the members of the DBI said that they supported this project, so looks like there'd be support there. I do worry about, and we brought this up at concept review, that the office space for attention homes, not the space that's going to provide supportive services for the residents, but the office space for attention homes, was causing some of that mass and scale. We talked about that before. On the conditions, I'm supportive of the staff's conditions for parking, and we can go into that because it sounds like we're going to have a discussion. And then I'm a little bit concerned that there's no working agreements worked out with the community. I just think that and I don't think we can require it as far as it's not in our site review. It's something that we might flag that we could talk about later, so we don't run into this situation again. I do want to say that after Macon Cole spoke at the last council meeting, he did talk about transitional housing. It is allowed. You just look at our trustee land use code that I carried over here today. It's allowed by right as long as it conforms to the underlying zoning in every single zoning district in the city except for mobile homes and agriculture. And so there were a number of things that triggered the site review for this, but I think that is important that we have that for the community. I just think the mass and scale is my big sticking point. The restaurant and some of the professional offices.
So we'll definitely come back to those in the site review criteria and use review, especially of the professional office and restaurant, and to some extent parking. So, great, thank you, Crystal. Liz?
Yeah, so overall, I think the project is approvable with conditions, and whether those are fatal or not, or up to the applicant. But the use reviews, some of those I have a less favorable view of and may not inclined to support. So that's where I'm at, just overall general statement.
Great, thank you. Harmon?
I just gave John a piece of blank scrap paper because he's been writing down all of our comments, and I'm going to mercifully not make him fill it up. Like Liz, I can just say that, I'll save most of my comments for when we really deliberate. And generally, the application seems approvable to me, and I'll just focus on some of the changes that were made between concept plan and now our site review. The setback issues and the architecture seem to be really well handled for me to create architectural conformity in the neighborhood. I really like the 15th Street facade, which reminds me a lot of the 400 block of Mapleton on the north side of the street with the attached housing, the historical attached housing along there. I think it's a nice tip of the cap to Boulder's classic architecture. That said, I'm not too crazy about the gable on the Pine Street, I think it is side, because I just like that kind of flat roofed look, but Dab like the gable, and they're the design professionals. So really the project doesn't require a lot of big lifts in terms of meeting the site review criteria, except the parking, which numerically is a very big lift. And again, I think with conditions, it can be approved.
Great, thank you, Harmon. Brian?
So yeah, I actually think this is a really positive project. Beyond just the story of attention homes and the sort of heart mission of all of that, I think it's a pretty decent urban design element as well. And I really like the fact that we're able to and required to look at the entire block at once. It's something we actually don't usually get to do at this level. So I think as a result, we're getting to do a lot of strong urban design moves with nice building floor designs, two-story buildings, massing the height of the building towards the back in the alley where it's less of an impact, or higher up the hill, actually. And so I don't think the density is unreasonable. I think that, when you're trying to get a building over a parking garage and with elevated corridors on the second floor, it can be really tricky to get all that stuff to work relative to height. I do think the mix of uses is great. I think having a sprinkling of variety in there is really positive. So I'm not concerned about that myself. But I do share David's concern about parking. I really would want to see it as close to sort of some principles as possible, and would really prefer either a parking lease that only gives them the right to park, or the right to park during certain hours, but not necessarily exclusive stalls. And then if we have to have signage that indicates the same thing of time of use, as opposed to a dedicated stall that's going to sit empty forever, waiting for someone to show up. But I think that's the only condition I'm sort of interested myself.
Great, thank you, Brian. Peter?
I agree that it seems approvable with questions, conditions. As a new planning board member, it's hard not to go back to some of the comments, but they weren't all relevant. Someone even said that, sorry that we're bringing this to you, we just had nowhere else to go. And that's the thing that's sticking for me, is that such a portion of the population nearby felt unheard. But at the same time, a lot of folks who live there and are natives are in favor. So to me, I don't like the way the process happened, and there's no going back. But someone did say this is what sanctuary looks like, and that is a messy endeavor. So we're sticking to what we have the ability to opine on, and it looks approvable.
And I'll add, I think I agree with the general thrust of the board's opinion. I also agree that it's approvable. Also want to talk about parking and flag a couple of issues, really picking up with where you were, Peter. I think one is we do recognize some of the questions about the point in time at which funding is approved and people make those applications. Unfortunately, that's not a criterion we have right now. And actually, we recommended, I think it was last Thursday, as part of the comp plan revision, that new process be added to consider some of these things throughout the life cycle of a process. So we heard you and recognize you, but we are bound by our code, and so that's a factor we can't consider. I think the other piece that I think engendered a great deal of community concern really relates to, is this the right use in terms of the right tenants for the community? And council, I think, made a conscious decision to say this use is allowable, as Crystal noted, in this area and other areas in town, and so we do not have discretion to consider that issue. I know there were suggestions that we go ahead and bypass that and just do what we're going to do, but that's really only a way to create more litigation, because it would likely create Fair Housing Act as well as code compliance related issues, and I think that doesn't serve anybody. That's a legislative decision that belongs in front of council and not ourselves. So with that, I do think the only other thing I'll say is to echo some of the notions about the mass and scale of this. I think that was a real big concern we did have when we saw this on concept review. And I'll say, at least for myself and my slightly more than 4 years, I think this is a project that's seen the most evolution to really get from a place that I think really did make folks uncomfortable on that ground to one that actually I think works quite nicely in the neighborhood for a lot of the reasons that Harmon identified. So with that, I think that gives us a sense for kind of big picture. Why don't we start burrowing into details, starting with the site review, and a number of the issues that are identified up here relate to that. The Boulder Valley Comp Plan compliance relates to the site plan and is one of our site review criteria. So why don't we start with that? I think folks have already weighed in on that. The staff has made the recommendation that that does comply for all the reasons that are documented in the staff report. So does anybody disagree with staff's assessment and would like to discuss that? Crystal?
There's just a few things. I mean, I would have liked to have seen the building brought down to 35 feet. You know, they said it, the site slopes down 4 feet. You know, downtown, it's usually between 2 and 4 or a half a block. I guess I'm willing to live with the height because you did push it in the back. But I have to say, the alley on the south side got better. The alley on the north side, just, if you look at your plans,
And are you focusing on BVC compliance or site review?
oh, site review. Are you
So we're
talking
just
about
looking at the
BVC? Oh,
BVCP
okay.
portion of site review for
Okay, I'll
now.
bring that up. I thought when you said site review, we were,
I think you did mention some of those issues in your initial statement.
I'll talk about the alley later.
Okay.
Under the real site review.
Any reason why people would not approve this on the basis of BVCP compliance?
No.
Okay, so why don't we move on? And I'd like to combine the design guidelines and site review because they both address some of the same design, height, massing, and other sort of areas. And the height does fit into this one, so maybe start with you, Crystal, just to focus on that. Really,
Yeah.
originally starting of whether or not this is approvable as is or would require
Yeah.
conditions.
Let me just say, there's one thing that kind of bugged me through reading all the DDAB comments as well as some of the site review and the applicant's statement, and that was referring to these blocks as a transition to the neighborhood. These are actually residential 2 blocks. Now, maybe the church should have come in for the comp plan and got the ones right adjacent or on the south side of the alley changed to a different zone because there's nothing really on that block that even resembles residential. But it is, but the block and especially facing Pine, it's not a transition to the neighborhood. It is part of the neighborhood. I mean, some people who grew up here remember that there actually were houses along Pine Street, and the church removed them to put in the parking lot. So the residential character was changed to what people say the ugly parking lot. It wasn't always like that, and people were hoping to have that restored to residential. So we are going to get residential, and I do support having residential and the transitional housing. So I thought I'd, bring that up. That was just a little peeve when you read the design guidelines or when you read the comments.
So
But I think the building got so much better between concept review and what we're looking at for approval tonight in a lot of ways, except for the alley.
So is there anybody who would add any conditions related to design, height, setback, massing, the other site review criteria? Liz?
Just one, really, and I echo what everybody said about how improved the project is. The architecture, design, so much better, and you have buildings with the bottom in the middle and the top, and all those really important classical principles are employed, so I really appreciate that. And I think it's fits into the neighborhood much better than the one we saw at concept plan. The only issue I have is really with that front porch, and I sort of agree with Harmon about the gable.
Can I interrupt just a second? I think we may want to put up on the screen the perspectives. We have that slide.
Yeah, that'd be good.
So, sorry to interrupt.
No, that's an excellent suggestion, because I'm just looking at this piece of paper, and I don't know what everybody else is looking at, so,
That work?
yeah, that's helpful, right. So in the lower right, you see the porch and the gable, and I think if you keep the gable, that's fine, but the porch, the way it spans both the wood-sided portion and then extends into the next module or whatever, it has this kind of almost colonial sort of plantation look to it. And I don't think that really is very compatible or sympathetic to the neighborhood. So I would prefer, and I would suggest that that porch, the span of that porch be reduced so that it just spans the green gabled portion. That fits more with the Victorian kind of buildings that you see around this neighborhood. And it's not quite so jarring, and it's more logical also that your porch, I mean, if you're really trying to give the impression of sort of individual sort of articulation or whatever, so you look like you have different buildings there, to span these two really very different components with one porch, just to me, it sort of violates my expectation of a logical kind of porch on an individual building. So that would be my suggestion, would be to just cut that porch back so that it just spans the gabled portion.
So that would be a recommended condition to
Yeah.
reduce the extent of that. What do other folks think about that? Harmon, you also addressed that same section.
Yeah, so I wish we could speak with one voice, but Liz was correct when she said she kind of agrees with me. For me, the problem is in the gable being a Cape Cod gable on a colonial look. And I just don't like the fact that it's got an asymmetrical split subordinate gable underneath the main pediment, which is actually a colonial style. And to kind of mix this Cape Cod with this Boulder vernacular quasi-classical doesn't work for me. So, I like the idea of just having a more prominent squared off bay to demonstrate that that's the entrance area, make it the parapet wall a few feet higher than the surrounding modules. And the porch was less important for me. I kind of liked that it was big and generous, actually, and wide. It was really just the mixing of the architectural styles and the context-inappropriate Cape Cod pediment that I didn't like.
So Liz, just as a question, did you have similar thoughts about the gable, different thoughts about the
No,
gable?
there are lots of gabled buildings, And really, even right across the street, there are tall, narrow, gabled buildings. So that didn't bother me so much.
Brian?
Yeah, I'll chime in on the downtown urban design guidelines portion of this. But specifically talking about what you guys are talking about right off, the gable.
We can keep to this little chunk just so we can wrestle this one down and then
Okay,
move
for
on
sure.
to any different topics folks might
Yep.
have.
Yeah,
Topics
that-
within this issue.
The
Yeah.
kind of gabled section and then the porch that expands beyond the gabled section.
Yeah.
Harmon and Liz's concerns.
Yeah, that actually, I mean, kind of up above that in scale. The applicant was, I think, really flexible in working with staff and DAB on that. We saw a lot of different options, and I think this is the one that everyone sort of in the end felt like was the best option. I personally feel like the whole building moved in a sort of an unnecessarily historical direction in terms of, the conglomeration of lots of little buildings put together, which I know is a historical style. It's not one that's really in Boulder, but it is a thing for sure. And I think, historically, if anybody had accumulated a quarter or half a block in Boulder, they would have done what everybody else did, which is to make a nice brick building out of it, which had an entry and like really nice fenestration. And they would have called it a day at that. But we're making them do all these little ins and outs and changes in materials and stuff, which I think is a little crazy. But that's what we're making them do right now.
Are we making them do that? When you
Yeah.
say we're making them do that?
I think the city process is taking in that direction. And I also think that the neighborhood spoke about wanting to see something more historical as well. So I think that was something that staff was interpreting as a positive gesture towards the neighborhood. The proportioning and gabling or not gabling or width of the porch of that element, I think, is something that would be maybe best left as a condition to be sent back to DAB with some instructions or some questions as a way of handling it. I think it could use more work. We did spend a lot of time on it. Lots of little elemental changes too, things like making sure the gable goes back far enough that it looks like a whole piece of roof as opposed to a portico sticking up or a little sort of fake western front and things like that. So I think that might be the way to handle it.
Maybe start with Harmon and Liz. What do you think of that recommendation?
I think that's fine. The only issue I have with that is that two of the DAB members are the applicants. And so if you look at the minutes, it's funny because they recuse themselves, but they're the presenters. So, and it's only 5 people altogether. So it's a little, I'm sure they can work out a solution to what we're talking about, but it's awkward the way it works, and we would never do that on planning board, for example. So
Make a quick comment on that. Recently, DAB has changed their policy on that.
Okay.
So if you were recusing yourself as an applicant, you'll not be in the room. So if we were to send it back to them, that wouldn't be what happened next time.
I see, okay.
Harmon, and then I think David and Crystal.
Well, I just would say I'm infinitely more comfortable sending it back to DAB than redesigning the applicant's building here at Planning Board and Site Review. And comforted that DAB has adopted our rules or something like our rules for recusal. So that's great.
David? Oh,
Are we addressing the deck now as well?
it's the deck and the gable, just that kind of portion of the design right now.
The deck seems accessible, if at all, by only 2 studios. And while that's, I would hope would be some kind of incentive or however the program works for who gets units 203 and 204, can they use them? If so, how? And it looks kind of like a frat house deck that's just waiting to fall into disrepair. That's my thought on the deck. And then I thought about, is it usable and by who? By the community? Is it just these 2? Are there operable windows? Are there doors? How will it be used?
It's actually not accessible.
It's not, so it's purely decorative.
Yeah.
Well, then it. Okay.
David, then Crystal?
I just wanted to point out that at 1424, the historic building that's going to be relocated, it has a gable, and I just kind of liked the echoing of that gable in the new construction. And I'm not an architect, but that was just my opinion. So I thought I'd point that out.
Great, thank you, David. Crystal?
I mean, I agree with Dave's opinion, and Liz, those are good points, and I'd support maybe taking off part of that long span, because it does seem a little bit more honest architecturally. And it's okay that there's a lot of decks in between Mapleton and Goss Grove and Whittier, or porches that might have a railing but don't have access.
So would anybody be uncomfortable with a condition that this portion of the design go back to DAB as one of the conditions for approval? And someone will have to make a motion, but are people generally comfortable with that?
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. What other design guideline, site review comments do folks have, if any?
I've got one on the commercial space.
Okay.
From what I can tell, there's no bathrooms in the commercial space. And I don't understand how that would operate functionally as a commercial space, and where the people who operated what I assume to be the cafe would go to the bathroom. Seems like it's asking for a problem.
And I think it's a good question, and maybe ask staff if they've got feedback on that issue, and then the extent to which we can reach that issue, and whether that's a site review or a use review question.
See a restroom accessible from the interior of the building for, I assume, the occupants, members,
Occupants and
guests,
staff.
but not accessible via the commercial space.
Yeah, I was under the impression that because there's doorways opening between the commercial space and the office space, that they would use those same restrooms. I think the applicant could clarify that.
I don't see those doorways. I see it.
I think there's other projects that we've looked at that send people outside to go to the restroom.
Oh, you're talking about the commercial space on the corner.
Right.
Okay.
Room 114, floor 1.
So, Spruce Confections downtown and Steel Yards, and there's a bunch of places where you have to go outside and go down the corridor.
But will they be allowed to go in the corridor of this building if it's a special transitional housing? They can't, anyone in the public can go in and use the bathroom?
Yeah, I think that's a fair clarifying question to ask the applicant, and then maybe
Okay.
turn back to staff in terms of how that fits into our site review and use review criteria. Jeff? Thank you. If you could just make sure you state your name for the record.
Thanks, John. Jeff Dawson with Studio Architecture. There's actually going to be one bathroom in the retail space, and then we have 2 bathrooms for the office space in the back. So they're provided in both locations, one for each use.
And is that bathroom shown on the plans? 'Cause
I don't think it may not be shown on the schematic plans, but it will be in the design doc, the tech docs, and the building permit docs.
So if we were to suggest a condition on that, that sounds like one you wouldn't object to?
Absolutely. It'll be required, yeah.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Good catch.
Anything else on the site review design guideline? Crystal?
Just the alley. We tagged the alley in concept review, and like I said, the alley got better on the south side. We talked about the alley as connecting all these various uses on the block or the First Methodist campus, and that was an opportunity. But it just seems like if you look on the alley looking northeast in the upper left-hand corner, which is on the slides up here, if there was something they can do, and some kind of planting with an architectural feature like a trellis or something to inject some green in that area. And I understand that the parking garage is underneath that whole area, so there's some limitations on giving up a couple of alley parking spaces and planting trees. But I'd like to see something that softens that facade, because people do use that alley. And it is, it's going to be a pretty prominent facade from Spruce Street, even people on Spruce Street as they're walking by.
Hey, Crystal, you're talking about the right-hand side of that view, right? Not the left-hand side of the alley looking northeast? You're talking about the alley proper part of it, right? Not the
Yeah.
West side?
Yeah,
Okay.
the alley,
The south side of the building?
yeah.
Thanks.
Basically, the
Does that clarify
southeast
it?
corner of the building.
Yeah, no, thanks. I was just asking.
Just to make sure we're all focused on the right corner.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, the southeast corner of, okay, up in the left-hand image photo, there is, you go down to the parking garage, and then the whole space from the parking garage over to the east is basically a blank wall, except when you get to the bike parking, which I don't believe has any landscaping, and I don't think you can see into the courtyard from there either. That's just a suggestion.
I think it's fenced off. What do others
You could-
think? Oh, go ahead.
Add it to the DDAB list somehow, if it's going to go to DDAB. You know, I'm not asking for a big redo of a facade or the building, but just, I think it would enhance the structures. If you think about walking by Brasserie 1010 over back to the mall, you know, they've got pots there, they've got the bonnets, so to speak, that's what they were called, that brought green into that space, so.
What do folks think? Liz?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I think even window boxes. I don't know if you can require but if you're walking down an alley and the residents have obviously put some thought into the alley pedestrians and what the people in the alley might see, that would be a really nice thing. So I don't know if window boxes is something that people do.
I was, were you done?
Yeah.
I was thinking the same thing, and I, you know, I heard you giggling a little about window boxes, but they're wonderful. And one of the things that window boxes do is, you know, they get dry and they need to be watered. And if a staff member has to go out, sure, it's an additional maintenance responsibility, but it also means somebody's walking back there and seeing trash or seeing, you know, other things that are not being taken care of, or doors that have graffiti on them, or, you know, whatever happens in alleys. And so it's just sort of a built-in maintenance and attentiveness requirement. So I think something like window boxes, we could suggest that to DAB and see what the applicant thinks and just let it go at that.
And they're going to be outside of a resident's window, and that could connect them more to the neighborhood, and who knows? People might get really creative with what they put in their window boxes.
David?
Yeah, and I'll just add that this particular alley is very convenient for pedestrians, and it's a way to get from the Boulderado and to E-Town Hall, for example. So it's having it improved would be really useful from that perspective.
So, Brian?
I just want to ask a question of staff, since I know they're super familiar with all the details of this project. Carl, is there space for planting along that alley section there? I don't know if it's required.
It's very tight, you know, because we're dealing with, you know, we wanted additional parking spaces added to accommodate the use. They tucked them in there. They had to put the short-term parking in there. That filled up some space, and then they have to meet, you know, site triangle. So it is a bit difficult in that space.
Thanks.
Did you have a comment as well, or just a question?
Well, I just was inquiring about that to see if it was a good idea to suggest planting there, but it sounds like it isn't. So I'm not going to suggest that. But, you know, if you guys want to ask DAB for window boxes, that's cool with me.
Would anybody have an objection if a condition were made to expand the scope going back to DAB, just to look for ways of softening that kind of south wall along the alley, including considering window boxes, but not saying what the ultimate result would be, but just to address Crystal's original concern, to look for ways to soften that?
Yeah, that's reasonable.
I might mention lighting. Haven't seen a lighting plan, but lighting and planting and softening architectural designs, whatever.
I think there was a lighting plan in there. So, good. Well, that sounds like, Peter?
Not on alley or lighting.
okay. I think we actually got to some resolution on what we want to do with that issue. So, different issue?
Sustainability features, what energy code does this fall under? What was what research was done in solar. It seems like there's a lot of great south-facing roof here.
Is that a question for staff, maybe?
I'm curious
Yeah.
from
Carl, you
history,
wanna-
since I wasn't here for the original concept, I don't see much in the way of any features. I'm just curious what's baked in from code.
I believe they're exempt from the new energy code because of when they submitted their site review application. In order to meet the site review criteria, we did add a condition of approval that would require pre-wiring for solar on the roof.
But that said, the existing energy code, IECC plus 30, is still incredibly robust, so.
So is there a recommendation to do anything, or is that?
I wanted to surface it. If it's pre-wired like diagonal crossing, we'll see what they ever do. But it'd be nice to see how current applicants handle the new code.
I think that's a good point.
It's kind of a corollary on that is I guess there was an answer to the HVAC solution, which was the little units in each. Was that satisfactory to the board? It sounded okay to me, but I just wondered if anybody had any nagging questions about that.
From my perspective, I think they're fine. They're quiet enough and they're efficient enough. They're not my favorite thing, but they are also entirely run on electricity, which is great for sort of future PV installations, or if the city goes to a municipal system that's all green, then that's really fantastic. So that in of itself is something the city is pushing for on multifamily projects right now.
Other comments? I'll just throw out for myself that I was worried about this originally based on the comments, but based on the decibel levels that were identified, I do think that's sufficiently below the noise standards that would be appropriate, and it does have some benefits. Crystal?
Just, I couldn't remember if they had electric vehicle charging down, in the parking garage, because we've asked applicants to put those connections in.
I was going to say we could, cherry pick some things out of the new code that people want to apply to this, and I think EV charging would be one that I think is really important.
All right. Before we go to David, are people generally supportive of a potential EV condition?
Yeah.
Okay. David?
I just wanted to confirm, I didn't see anything in the plans about the use for the rooftop in any sort of deck configuration or anything. I just wanted to confirm that that's the case. There's no deck, roof deck or anything.
There's no roof deck.
Okay.
Any other comments on design guidelines, site review?
I have a small one. 40 years, this could cease being transitional housing and then will go to permanently affordable. At that time, I assume the first floor will be reconfigured to fit. I'm curious what changes would need to be made to convert transitional to affordable. It seems like it's been considered already, given the layout. But I'm curious if that came up at all and what consideration was made.
Because of the nature of the occupancy would be changing if it were to cease being transitional housing and going to a different type of housing, it would reopen the site review. We'd have to reevaluate the parking. If they shift over to a different type of unit, it's going to change the whole parking dynamic. So it would impact what kind of conditions of approval might be applied, or it might change the unit count. The parking would have to meet the original intent.
Okay.
A similar question, though, that will come up in use review. If the use were to change, or if the attention homes or somebody transition to somebody else, if we just approve professional office, could that transition to any other type of professional office without additional approval, or would we need to add a condition?
I believe that if you read the conditions of approval related to the professional office, we routinely allow for staff level conversions from a like use to another like use. They have to have a similar operating characteristic. So we assess every time there's a change to make sure that there's not an increased parking impact or something that could create an impact on the neighborhood. But if it's commensurate with the original use, it can be approved administratively.
The operating characteristics and condition of approval would also apply to that changed use.
Okay, so anytime that they would change the nature of the use, that would change intensity in parking and trip generation, that sort of thing, that would generate a requirement for an approval, at least on a staff level.
Right.
Okay, great.
So I would think, I mean, I don't know where they're going to have the offices that are going to be supportive to the residents. And so if that was delineated, then that could be tied to the transitional housing and tied to the maybe permanently affordable in the future.
Is that already part of the use, professional office use that tied to the kind of non-site specific?
There's 9 employees that would be working in that professional office. There's 3 additional but separate employees that would serve the transitional housing. So they're basically viewed in different categories.
But Carl, I thought just for clarification, I thought, so 9 employees that are attention home employees, but not necessarily supportive to the specific transitional housing when we talk about supportive services for some of the programs for the residents. Do you know that? Or we could ask the applicant.
I mean, I think the applicant can elaborate further. I mean, there's 3 employees that would be in the portion of the building serving those 40 residents that would be separate from that office.
Are they the people that are monitoring the entry and area and checking people in?
I believe so, but I'm going to have to defer to the
I'll
applicant on
ask.
that.
When we get some
But
clarity.
it is a separate principal use that's being proposed. It's not accessory to the housing use.
Do you want to nail that clarifying question down now with the
Yeah.
applicant?
So
There-
I don't know if Attention Homes wants to answer that or whoever's appropriate.
Yeah, whoever.
Can you restate the question?
So, first of all, can you explain the 9 employees and the 3 employees? The 9 employees are like Attention Homes, staff and accounting and things like that, I'm assuming.
Administrative office. personnel.
Administrative office?
Yes.
Okay. And then the 3 other employees are?
Case managers, there are folks who provide employment counseling, other, behavioral health services that would come in and provide those services. Most of them are well below a full-time equivalent employee. So those 3 folks would be on staff and in the building, again, serving the residents of the building. And that's, I think, what's unique about the transitional housing use is the supportive services that are provided and co-located with the housing. So I think maybe to the question, if the transitional housing use were to need to be amended and transition to typical multifamily housing, something like that, then obviously those staff people would presumably most likely go away.
Now, one other question, Shannon, is then the employees that are going to work in reception in the lobby, were they the people that testified, the company that testified?
Ross Property Management, yes.
And so are they in addition to the 9 and the 3?
Yes, except they are the property manager for the entire block, so they don't necessarily office on site. They provide property management services to the church and to all the other tenants on the block as well.
Well, who checks residents in and out through
Right.
the
So
entry?
we have a front desk that will be a rotating staff person that will be there during the day. So it could be a case manager who's there. It could be another staff person who sits there to monitor the front door. And then certainly in the evening hours, that will be staffed.
Is it an
pretty
Attention
exclusively.
Homes employee?
Well, these will be employees of Attention Homes Apartments.
Okay.
Great, thank you, Shannon. Any other site review, design guideline, other criteria that would include open space and landscape? Otherwise, I think the next critical issue we need to tackle is parking.
One last question.
Sure.
The issue of the shed, the Cajun shed.
The Cajun shed, yes, behind Lucille's.
A mention was made there would be some kind of change, some alteration, some addition, a new shed, not a new shed, and that would seem to fall under this area. Physical structure on the site.
And landscape and open
Yeah.
space.
Maybe Carl can again answer that, because it looks like on the plan there's an existing shed and a new shed, and I don't know what those are.
So we recognize that this might be a condition that changes based on the civil discussions between Lucille's and the property owners. But again, it's a shed. It's something that we could handle through a minor mod if it were to shift locations, if it's interior to the site. It's going to be limited as far as how much larger it could be. It has to be generally pretty consistent, but there's some flexibility there.
Okay, so it's minor. Whatever's going to happen is minor.
Yeah, and there's a preliminary plat and final plat process, and we need some clarification of where the lot lines are going to end up internal relative to the shed as well.
And can we or do we need to address any questions about that dispute related to the lease between the church and Lucille's?
That's a private matter.
Great, thank you. So
Well,
any-
it's a private matter, but it's on the site plan. Right now, it shows no shed. So which is,
Key to the dispute.
Well, that was my question. I think right now it shows both the existing shed and a new shed. So I was just trying to ensure that they had the ability to handle that between them and that there was space in our approval for a shed.
I just don't want to be
there
the
is.
body that drove Eggs Pontchartrain out of the city.
right.
Not this kid.
Not this year.
Good, any last issues? Otherwise, let's go to parking. Anyone like to, I know there've been a few questions about parking. This issue is in part related to the use review on the leasing of parking. So I'd suggest that we kind of tie those conversations together, just because I think it's hard to separate them. Staff has obviously recommended that we approve the roughly 60%, 62% parking reduction, but limit the number of spaces that could be leased. The applicant obviously was interested in more. David, I know you mentioned this issue first. Do you want to get us started here?
Well, yeah, I did really resonate with what Zane said when he was here and testifying to us about, and I do think it would be nice if we could give the 33 lease spaces, but the only way I could make the numbers make sense is if we get rid of the signs and make the parking spaces more first come, first served. And once you start down that path, it just seems very hairy to make to design it out. And I don't think that's our job, And I haven't seen alternatives come to us that convince me that that they've figured out how to do it without making the ones that are kind of up for grabs. So it's such a small number that it's really making one part of the served population majorly inconvenienced while other people have reserved spots ready for them at all times. Yeah. So I just don't know. It might be overly complicated for us to try to solve this, but I really desire to try to give them the 33 spaces if we could go in that direction. Yeah. So I don't know if anybody has a brilliant idea on how we can do it without getting into the weeds.
It has been done before. So I actually am part of an HOA in North Boulder in Holiday where they have time of use signage. It actually works really, really well. It does require occasional reminders, and sometimes things get a little goofy, but the way it's set up is that it's a combined office and residential use, and the residents have essentially assigned parking at night only, and then anybody can use it during the day. And so we've basically come up with a way of signing it that's just, you have, this is when you have exclusive use and this is when you don't. And I think, I don't know what the signage program would have to be, but I think we could basically sort of build that into a condition that staff would then figure out through the tech doc process. So I'm actually pretty comfortable with it. I think it works pretty well. And with that, going to the 33 number.
So to back up for just a minute, is anyone uncomfortable with the kind of underlying recommendation on the parking reduction, putting aside the question of how you sign it and how you end up being able to lease some of those spaces.
I will say one more thing. I'm not uncomfortable with the parking reduction. I think that that it's a reasonable number of spaces for the site. I do think that I do wonder if we could ask for a policy to require or ask tenants to pledge that they won't own cars and park them in adjacent neighborhoods. That if they're going to sign this lease, that they need to wait until they have a space, so they have the seniority or whatever it is that you do to earn one of those 7 spaces, but that you actually agree to not own a car and park it in the neighborhoods because that puts pressure on the neighborhood. And I'm not sure if it's within our purview to be able to do something like that, but I would love to do a condition like that.
That has also been done before.
Yeah, I think that there can be measures like that are incorporated to reduce the parking needs of the project. I think we've had student housing projects with similar conditions.
Crystal?
Are the units, are the 40 units, are they going to be limited to one resident per unit outside of maybe a couple of them that had the bedrooms, and you could imagine a parent and a child?
Shannon, if you want to address that one.
Yeah, I have a slide I want to show you.
If you could just reintroduce yourself for the record.
Shannon Cox Baker.
And this just will address my question.
Yeah. Yes. Just your question. Okay. So there's a difference between the code's occupancy limits, and then because this project has been awarded 40 project-based vouchers from the Division of Housing, it has different occupancy limits. And so what you can see here on the table is that studios are both have a minimum and a maximum household size of 1 occupant, 1 bedrooms, minimum of 1, maximum of 2, and then we only have 1 2-bedroom, minimum of 2, maximum of 4. So the minimum number of occupants would be 41, the maximum would be 56 based on those vouchers. And of course, what we know from this demographic is that they are almost without exception unaccompanied youth or unaccompanied young adults, and are not married, are not parents, and typically are not guardians of any siblings. But in those rare instances, that's why we have included a 2-bedroom unit to be able to accommodate that.
Great, thank you, Shannon.
Can I ask staff a question?
Yeah, go for it, Liz.
So, Carl, what are some other residential projects that have a 62% parking reduction? Is Holiday, I mean, Brian was talking about Holiday, does that have a 62% parking reduction?
I don't know the particulars of Holiday, not having looked at it recently. The Washington Village project had a pretty high parking reduction. It was around like 50%, but that was based on different parking requirements at the time.
And they have that underground garage underneath the Broadway facade, and then they have, and then a number of them have their garages attached to their units.
Yeah, and that was all originally based on a kind of an antiquated parking requirement that was in the same zone, actually, that was based on square footage. So that's changed. Nothing jumping out at me at the moment.
I don't think we've reviewed a lot of transitional housing projects in the last
No,
years either.
I know, but I mean, if we're citing personal anecdotes about our neighborhoods and stuff like that, I would kind of like to know the entire picture, not just the one.
Please don't attack that. All I'm trying to say is there's a program that can handle the signage. I'm not saying that that has anything to do with this project in terms of use profiles. It's not transitional housing. Well, actually, a couple of them are, but it also isn't I'm not arguing for or against, using that as an example to argue for or against a parking reduction. It's really just about the signage.
Okay.
So are you uncomfortable with the parking reduction?
Well, I want to, like you said, I mean, we kind of have to consider the parking reduction and the entire TDM plan, I think.
Right.
And this lease situation, sort of all together, and make sure that it's adding up. Like, for example, the eco passes. If we cut the number of lease spaces.
I have a list somewhere.
Or increase the number of lease spaces, so there are fewer sort of free spaces. But at the same time, the applicant is asking to cut the number of eco passes that they give out. No eco passes to staff, for example, things like that. I mean, we're going to end up with a situation where there's potentially a lot of conflict there, and with the neighbors. And so I'm trying to, it's the whole package that we need to look at, and not just one piece of it. So I'm comfortable with the parking reduction if we can keep other aspects of it in place, other aspects of the TDM plan and the staff's leasing condition in place. But if we do the parking reduction and the EcoPass reduction and the free space or non-lease space reduction, that kind of thing, I think we end up with a problem, so.
I was able to pull up a list of parking reductions since I was working on the parking code changes a couple of years ago. There's some high percentages, they tend to be commercial, but there is one here for the Ledges project at 985 16th with a 50% parking reduction.
Great, thank you, Carl. Harmon, did you have a?
Yeah, I guess I do. I think taking the anecdotal tack, one thing we didn't hear a lot of, I think in public comment was, though it was said, but I don't think it was said a lot, was that there was a huge parking problem in the neighborhood. And we did hear from the applicant that there was adequate parking as it is to accommodate even more leased spaces than are being proposed. So, I think from that perspective, it's less scary to authorize the parking reduction than it is from the simply numerical perspective, because 62% sounds like a pretty darn big number. So I think it's important as we review this to look at what's the situation on the ground. As far as requiring a covenant for the people who lease the units to not have cars over and above the 7 spaces that are allowed, again, that creates a conundrum because, we're trying to help these kids get jobs, and a lot of jobs aren't accessible without a car. And so, we're handicapping kids who might need to drive somewhere to get their work. At the same time, one of the reasons for this project's location is that it's accessible to transit and has a lot of bike parking and is offering eco passes. So I think there are a ton of conundra when it comes to this. And the answer for me is that I'm comfortable with the parking reduction as proposed by staff.
Are you comfortable with their proposal to have the 23 leasable spaces?
Yeah, I think we could talk a little bit more about that. And really, when we're talking about a negotiation, the sides aren't very far apart. We've got 23 and 33. So, I don't think that's going to be, that's not the biggest issue for me.
Other perspectives, Crystal?
I mean, I have to say, reading the Tuttle Fox report, and they've been doing analysis of parking in most of the neighborhoods in the city, and parking downtown. We're lucky we have a totally successful downtown area. We've just added or I should stop and say, everything in Caged is meant by the Caged district and by their EcoPass program. But still, you have parking throughout all the neighborhoods, so much so that they even had to extend when they were extending the Whittier parking district, they had to extend it up to Sunset and High to keep the overflow from going up there, because it's sort of like sort of like water. Water will go to the lowest point, and parking will go to the least expensive. I do worry. I mean, I'm willing to go with the big parking reduction for the transitional housing, but I'm not willing to go with reducing the leasable spaces down lower, because.
You're not willing to increase the leasable spaces or decrease?
No, I don't want to decrease. Oh, wait, okay,
Yeah.
let me just say, I want to keep the leasable spaces at the staff recommendation.
And not bump it up to 33 or some other higher?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I got that backwards, yeah. And I just think there, with the office space, with the grab-and-go restaurant, and with our not being sure of are people going to have cars as they become more successful, which you want them to be, hopefully there'll be some job training on how to get around town using, using the existing eco-passes and transportation. And I too was a little bit disappointed. I was disappointed in the TDM, the Transportation Demand Management Plan, because it wasn't more vibrant and didn't provide eco-passes for, the other uses on the site, because that's part of the whole puzzle. You can't just look at the whole block and then cherry pick off different things. But I was also disappointed in us, the planning board and the city of Boulder, because we still haven't got the TDM, our Transportation Demand Management Program, revised. We've talked about this since I've been on planning board for 4 years. So I'm not just picking on Garner Capital and the TDM. I'm just saying we really need to get realistic here, or we're going to have the same discussion on every single site review. And they all come in for parking reductions. Google, Attention Homes, everybody comes into them, and we give it to them in the hopes that we will transition from cars to self-driving cars, to more Ubers and Lyfts, to bikes, or to a better eco-pass and a better transportation system. So thanks for letting me go off on a tangent, but we've got our heads in the sand if we don't think that this parking is going to spill out into the neighborhood. Now, I'm not worried about the church on Sunday or the church activities on Saturday, because they don't charge for the parking garages downtown. And so I know the churches are good about directing their people to the parking garages.
Liz and then David?
Well, just one idea, and that is that we could start with the staff recommendation. And, if it turns out, because there's a lot of speculation on the board here about what's really going to happen. And if it turns out that, in fact, there is no parking issue and people in the neighborhood feel comfortable with the way it's all operating, and the church still wants to lease more spaces, then they can come back in a couple years with some actual data on how it's working and ask for an increase in the number of leasable spaces. Is that something that they could do? Okay, and is there like a waiting period or anything?
No.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Let's hold it for board discussion
And
at this point. David, I think you.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that people understand that it isn't that straightforward, that if we increase the number of lease spots, that it's going to put more demand on the neighborhood. The problem right now is that when you allocate each even time-based, if during the week, if you know that one business gets these spots, one business gets these spots only, so one of those businesses has a meeting that fills up their conference room with about 10 guests with 10 cars. As soon as their 3 spots fill up, the rest of the 7 people have to go park on the street because every other space is signed for somebody else. So the real sump would be to allow that ebb and flow of when one group is using it more, the other group doesn't. I guess the catch is that you can't really do that easily with leased because you've guaranteed these people that they have a spot if you lease it. Or you just have to say, we guarantee that you're allowed to park here, but when it fills up, you're just like anybody else, any other citizen, and that may affect how much you can charge for those leases. But it's not as simple, you know. Once you put a sign on each one of those spaces and keep it at 23, you may actually be forcing more cars out into the neighborhoods in the long run, is my feel.
Wouldn't that be a bigger issue if you kept it at 33?
Well, if you allowed 33, but then got rid of the signs, then maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you would actually, because right now, honestly, lots that use this principle of putting a sign like that, they do end up underutilizing. And that's why the parking management plan does show it underutilized, because those signs, if a person from Attention Homes shows up and wants to park and all the Attention Homes spaces are filled, they have to go park in the street. That's just the way it is. Otherwise, the sign says right there, you will be towed, of course.
I'm hearing a couple of threads here. I think one would be to stick with the staff's proposed conditions and then come back if they ever want to and revisit that. The other, I think, may be looking at a higher number, but with more of an unbundled shared parking sort of arrangement. So just to kind of help the discussion, and we can fight this one out for sure when we have a motion on the table, but just as a straw poll, who's kind of leaning in the staff recommendation proposal bucket right now? So 3 folks, and then who's leaning in the other direction with the more sump, probably with somewhat higher number. So it's pretty close.
Yeah, with sump being the sort of most important part of that, I think.
So
which is shared, unbundled, managed, and paid.
Thank you, that's
thank you.
good. Yeah. Well, I just want to make sure that, you know, this is a huge new building. Even with the 9 office workers and the 3 restaurant spaces, the 3 restaurant spaces are going to accommodate the employees, not just the residents that are going to be hopefully working there, but the employees, the people that are going to grab and go. They're probably, I don't know what percentage are going to walk over and grab and go, or are going to stop and grab and go on their way to another place. So that's parking that I think is underparked. I think the professional offices, that's underparked. And then Lucille's, they have 3 spaces. They have more than 3 employees, and I can bet you that the 3 lowest paid, or the higher paid employees are probably getting those 3 spaces, maybe 1 for delivery, I don't know. But I can bet you that the lower paid ones are probably parking in the neighborhood and moving it into a different district after they hit their 3 hours and hoping they don't get a ticket. So I think it's underparked right now.
So here's my recommendation on how we
Why
move.
lease out spaces? More spaces.
Here's my recommendation on how we proceed with this, if you're all comfortable. I'd suggest that we ask Carl or somebody else for staff to just give us 15 to 30 seconds of why they proposed the 22 spaces. Give the applicant 15, 30 seconds just to address the issue that they had. And then my guess is we'll need to figure this out upon the actual motion, because it sounds like I think we've got a difference of opinion. David?
Could I ask for the applicant to actually also address what they think of this idea of the fully unbundled?
If they, I think,
If
keep
they-
it really tight.
If they can keep it tight.
We need
Yeah.
to keep things
I
moving.
am curious about whether it would help them or not.
Great. Why don't we start with staff, unless anyone's concerned about that approach? Carl?
So we had a lot of the same thoughts that the board is bringing up now about not signing spaces or having concerns about, you know, is it appropriate for Lucille's just to have 3 spaces based on the number of seats they have? I think we came to a realization in looking at the parking management plan, looking at the Fox Tuttle story, that I think we could get there by understanding the existing conditions on the site and seeing that that's a snapshot in time, that there is some capacity on the site, and that capacity could be filled with new uses. So we felt that if they could demonstrate to us that they could fill that remaining gap, that 30% we were talking about with the new uses and make it work, that really to get over that was to have the transitional housing information provided to us that would show that 7 spaces would work. At first, it was 0 spaces. We thought that they should add spaces for that use. We felt that 7 was appropriate based on the 3 employees and the likelihood of some residents having cars. And there was some information in the parking management plan that showed 10% as an appropriate number. I think then when we recognized that, it was just a matter of how are the other uses going to be accommodated. So that's why we felt that the condition allocating the specific spaces was appropriate. I mean, as city staff, our job is looking at this and how do we minimize impact on the neighborhood. We felt that allocating the specific spaces for the uses would be one way of doing that. And when you add up all the need, the remaining spaces based on the existing conditions was there would be 23 flex spaces. So that would be appropriate for leasing. That's basically how we got through our analysis. We felt that anything more than that would require unbundling, which it might be, one of the solutions here, but that it gets into a territory where it's more difficult to monitor. And I think that's where we felt we had to take a conservative approach because we can't really tell that if they unbundle some of the existing residential spaces or if they unbundle some of the professional office, how do we know as the city that that's the person might get paid to not park there, but how do we know that they're not parking in the neighborhood? How do we know that they're taking transit there? So we couldn't get to that point. So that's why we felt that this was the appropriate place to land.
Great. Thank you, Carl. Shannon, if you could give us 30 seconds or so.
Can I? Okay, I'm going to.
Absolutely, you can. Yes.
We have all of our transportation consultants here. So Scott Martin with Desmond Parking Management can address how we arrived at the 33 leased spaces. But just a couple of things that I wanted to try and tick through, because these are all connected, is the proposed parking conditions. So while the 62% reduction sounds like a big, scary number, it's what we're anchoring to, and it's this code requirement of 133 spaces for the church, which really skews what the reduction actually looks like. But if you were to look at the proposed parking condition to the existing condition, the actual reduction we're requesting is about 12% in parking, which is, I think, a staff level approval and a different sort of condition. Also, I would add that the only parking use where we are requesting, and I don't know why my slides aren't showing up on the screen, the only use where we're requesting a reduction is a transitional housing use. So all of the other uses on the block are being either parked to code or parked to a prior approval. And so I think there's some confidence in knowing that these tenants have been in place for many decades, in the case of the church, 150 years, that the existing parking condition is working quite well. A couple other things too. The tenancy here is very unique. Obviously, we've got tenants who have no income, who are homeless. They are all being provided.
Shannon, I think we've addressed some of those questions, and I think
Okay.
You had indicated a concern about the ability to revisit the
shared
22
parking.
and the
23.
shared parking question that David. So if we could just focus on those,
Right.
we've read the parking study, and I think we've been through them. So
Sure. Okay. Apologies. So again, in investigating the existing conditions, what we know and what I think the church could certainly verify is that the church has been leasing parking spaces for at least 2 decades, and we provided evidence in your packet of the last 8 years showing, on average, 34 spaces have been leased to the public during business weekday hours, and in the last 2 years, it's been 40 spaces and 53 spaces. So this being able to mix parking that's leased as well as balancing that with the existing and proposed new uses, it works, and again, supportable by the parking study that Fox Tuttle did and the shared parking study that Scott Martin did. And I just want him to comment quickly on the methodology that he used to get to 33 spaces, which is very different than the methodology that the city staff used to get to.
But I think that methodology was included in the report, which we've all read, so.
Okay.
What
so
would be helpful is a reaction to a notion of taking away the kind of signing conditions that was in staff's report.
Can you lease those spaces if they're kind of on a first come, first served unbundled, or do you have to put a sign up saying this is reserved for leasing number 33?
No, we're very flexible and open to that, and are looking to follow best practices. And this access management and parking strategy that City Council commissioned last year really reflects that. It talks about these SUMP principles. It talks about the way for shared parking to work well is to unbundle it and to not sign it, to allow for all that flexibility. And so I think when we start to talk about conditions on signage, signing the garage to say that it's for tenants on the block, it's not publicly accessible, or it's for permit holders only, I think that can start to maybe restrict at like a high level who's using that garage and parking there. But I do tend to agree with you that I think if we are too prescriptive about who can park where during what hours, we lose all the benefit of the shared parking.
I don't think you can get to 33 that way. Was I on? Yeah. I don't think you can get to 33 unless you do some sharing.
Right.
Because otherwise, Carl's numbers speak for themselves. It just adds up to 22 or 23.
Right.
So,
well,
yeah.
and again, I think in talking through the conditions, which I know will probably be more of a formal conversation, I would like to request that we would look at conditioning to 33 spaces with the potential for measuring and monitoring that. And then if it's not successful, then coming back and amending it down to a lower number, given that we've got 8 years of precedence showing that that exact number has worked.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. So back to the board, any further discussion about this before we wrestle with it at the very end?
I have to tell you, I'm willing to go with the transitional housing reduction. I mean, it makes sense with the population homeless 18 to 24, but I think you're going to be pushing a huge amount of this building and the other uses into the neighborhood, which will then trigger, going to city council to try to get their parking district tightened up. I've just got a call from Mapleton Hill. They want to knock off the 3 hours and get it down to 2 hours because you're supposed to have some white space, they call it. So people that have a guest coming over, there might be a chance that their guests can actually find a parking space on the street. And so what you're doing is by not being a little bit more conservative in this, you're going to get off on the wrong foot with your neighbors. And that's what's disturbed me about the process so far. We got off on the wrong foot, as Peter didn't say getting off on the wrong foot, but I'm so happy you brought that up about the process and getting the funding in place before anything was reviewed or could even be changed. And I just think we should do as much as we can to make sure that, you're going to be good neighbors, even if it means a little bit more conservative. And we actually, if people come back and say, gee, this hasn't been an impact for parking, rather than ratchet the on-site parking down and then leaving it up to the neighbors to complain. Who wants to be in that situation?
Any other critical points on this one? Why don't we partly park this one, and we'll come back to it. And then turn to the use reviews. Can you put the critical issues list back up? I think we've talked about parking, so the first of the use reviews that we need to talk about is the professional office. And again, this is for the 9 employees associated with the kind of general attention home operations and not the 3 specifically associated with this housing use. So staff has recommended that we find, based on the evidence in the packet and otherwise, that we find this is consistent. Does anybody disagree?
With the professional offices?
Yes. With staff's recommendation that we approve that use review.
Yeah, the thing that keeps bothering me is it could be professional offices for any group, anybody. For attorneys, let's say, we hope Attention Homes is going to be wildly successful. They get a new opportunity. It's in another zone. They decide to move some of their professional offices. And then this could be any use. I mean, I wish we could condition it to a nonprofit professional office or one that's associated specifically with Attention Homes. And I still don't understand when the church or when people have said that they've given the land to Attention Homes. Does that mean Attention Homes can lease out these professional offices if they finally don't need the staff at that site? I'm just a little bit clear, but I would really feel much more comfortable if we could condition it on this use that everybody, or a lot of people have testified, even people like, a lot of people have testified that it's so important to the community, but the offices could be attorneys or architects.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
No.
Peter?
It was attorneys. That was the first place I clerked in law school at CU, the corner there where Attention Homes is now. So it's been attorneys before.
Yeah, right.
That would be fine with the neighborhood, and it was then.
Yeah, it was professional, it was a use review for professional offices. But we're talking about a whole new building, and part of the building for me is the impact of having
I think it'll
that office space.
Imagine it'll self-select itself out. The commercial real estate market and tenancy will drive itself without our interference of who wishes to lease office space in that environment. It'll probably be a complementary use.
Well, do you mind if we ask?
Let's ask Hella first the scope of our ability to condition.
Yeah, when you're thinking about that, if you're thinking about drafting a condition, think about what use review criterion would not be met without that condition.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I brought the land use code. You have to let me have a few minutes on it, unless you have a suggestion to us. You're always so helpful.
Well, I'm wondering what you want to base it on or could base it on. The use review criteria mostly talk about compatibility with the area and minimal negative impacts and so forth. That's not necessarily. I don't see how, for example, limiting it to nonprofit professional office space. I don't see how we can link that into the use review criteria. But if you could describe the concern you have relative to the use review criteria and what criterion you're trying to meet, then maybe we can find something that fits. But right now, I'm not sure
that it's supportive to the residents in kind of not in a real direct by providing the program specifically, but it's supportive to the residents. If it could be tied to if the use review could be tied to the transitional housing more directly.
Yeah, I don't think we can do that because it is proposed as a separate use and it exists right now without the transitional housing facility. And I think it's that use that is being proposed to be continued just in a different building on that block.
So
Liz, I think actually Liz had her hand.
Well, I was just looking at the use review criteria and the one about provides direct service or convenience to or reduces adverse impacts to the surrounding uses or neighborhood. And I think it could reduce the adverse impacts if it were Attention Homes offices, just because they're just more eyes on what's happening there. But maybe that still isn't doesn't meet the criteria the way you just described it because it is a separate use or whatever. I don't know. To me, that seems like it does address that, the potential adverse impact, just because it's more eyes. Anyway,
By tying it to attention homes.
right.
Harmon?
So Liz, you and I have been on the same page a lot tonight. I was looking at the same criterion A, but I was going to go a slightly different direction. If it started out, the office use started out as serving attention homes, and then there was a change in tenancy, if the change in tenancy did not provide direct service or convenience to the neighborhood or did not reduce adverse impacts, that use could be challenged as a violation of the use review of the permit that was given under the use review. That's correct?
Yeah, I think they would come in anyways for a change of use. So either they come in for a change of use to make sure that they meet the approval criteria and operating characteristics for which the use review was approved. And if they don't meet that, then they would have to go through a use review.
And what would the process be when you have an approved use review for a use that's generally not available without use review in a residential neighborhood? Is it an update to the use review? Is it another hearing in front of planning board? Is it staff level?
It would have to be another hearing in front of planning board as a non-residential use in a residential zone.
Thanks.
What do others think about, I think, the concern that Crystal raised and Liz echoed, and I think Harmon pointed to one of the use review criteria? Any thoughts?
Go ahead.
Well, let's hear from some folks who haven't spoken yet and then come back.
I don't have anything.
Yeah, I'm still fine with the staff's recommendation.
Okay, Liz?
So I guess I don't know what was the answer to whether we can actually condition it to being attention homes offices, or, I mean, if we can't, then we can just stop talking about that, but.
Well, you mentioned based on the operating characteristics. I mean, you hear that often with restaurants, that they'll have to come back in based on the change in operating characteristics.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that this use can't meet the use review criteria unless they provide additional oversight to the housing use that's proposed next door?
I don't think so, because I think that if it could be other offices, and maybe there would be opportunities for internships or something like that, so it could support the residents if it were engineers, for example, maybe not lawyers. But anyway, but I do really, I mean, if there were a way to condition it to have it be attention homes employees, I think that would probably help reduce adverse impacts to the neighborhood, which is that criteria number one, so, A.
So,
Go ahead.
we've already heard multiple times from city attorney and others that transitional housing is a use that if it meets its own set of criteria that are not subject to our review, then it's allowed in any zoning district except a couple of residential zoning districts like manufactured. So it's really hard for me to think about trying to draw a nexus between a use that's allowed beyond our purview and a use that somehow needs a use review criteria to be met to have supervisory type office uses on site in order for that use to be allowed when it's allowed already. And I do have faith in the requirement that a change in use, a change in tenancy requires an entire new planning board hearing. And, that's a pretty unusual situation for a landlord to find him or herself in, to want to swap out a tenant when a lease is up and have to go in front of planning board to get it approved in a public hearing process. So you can bet that when that change in tenancy, if it ever takes place, is proposed, that this criterion A, provide direct service or convenience or reduce adverse impacts to the neighborhood, is going to be front and center in that review. Therefore, I'm satisfied.
Can I just check with staff on one of the things that you said, which is that tenancy change would require that? I thought I heard staff to say it was nature of the use. So if
Yeah.
even more attention homes, a similar nonprofit with same number of employees, and
Right.
traffic came in, that may not require a hearing, but if it turned into the engineers or, God forbid, lawyers, that might require a hearing before planning board.
That's correct.
Can I correct one, or just clarify one thing? The transitional housing has not been approved by city manager yet. Is that right?
No.
So we are not necessarily operating under the assumption that it has been.
No, I'm not either. I'm just saying that it's beyond our purview to decide on that, so.
Okay.
Well, but
And the reason why the city manager hasn't approved transitional housing is in the staff report. They haven't approved transitional housing because there'd be no point to approving transitional housing if the use and site reviews haven't been approved by planning board. You'd be approving transitional housing for a project that can't exist.
So Crystal, last
know,
thought on this?
yeah, if, as part of transitional housing, I think they said there'd be 3 staff people that would be doing the counseling and the, job placement and things like that. So I'm fine with that. But the part of moving the entire Attention Homes organization or their administrative organization to this building, and I said this at the very beginning as part of my input at the concept review after listening to people talk about the mass and scale, is those 9 positions are, and the attendant bathrooms and conference facilities and stuff are driving the scale. We don't have any other, or there are not any other offices that have been approved up and down Pine Street lately. I mean, when, a while ago where I think Jeff's office is, that was quite a while ago. But it makes it doesn't lessen the impacts. It increases the impacts, and I think parking is one of them. But anyway, that's my position on the professional offices. Transitional housing with the support facilities and even their, whatever they call them, their community rooms, they're fine. But the professional offices I find don't meet the use review criteria.
So I think this is another one that we'll probably have to resolve through the vote. Are there any additional new thoughts that we haven't had on this?
I just have a quick comment, which is that maybe we certainly wouldn't be in this pickle use-wise if the transitional housing definition included space for the supportive services that go along with it. It requires the supportive services, allows you to have the units, and also allows you to have, common central cooking facilities and things like that. But it would be really great if that definition included, office and support space for those services. Future land use code change.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
A lot of nodding heads on that one.
Yeah.
And just 1175 Lee Hill went in, use by right, has their supportive services, has a gathering room, didn't have a parking reduction, et cetera. I'm not saying that's a bit of a different demographic, and a number of them do have cars.
I just want to get a little bit more clarification. So professional offices is what's being asked for in this use review. And yet, and we were confused, or I was confused about whether a change in tenancy or a change in use would trigger an additional use review. And then it was said that if we changed over to a law office, that would trigger a use review. But to me, a law office would fall under the category professional office and is really just a change in tenancy. So can we get this clear?
So I think what Carl was talking about is that initially a non-residential use in a residential zone requires a use review and an approval from the planning board. Once that use and that approval is in place, there's an administrative passage in the code that allows us to review whether or not a change of tenancy or a change of use has an equivalency. In which case, if it's a lawyer's office that serves clients on site to an engineer's office that serves clients on site, not a huge difference in the operational characteristics, that's a change that we can improve administratively. If it's wildly out of characteristic or wildly out of alignment with the operational characteristics of the initially established use, we can send it back to the planning.
Okay, that's clear.
And if I could add, I think when I was answering your question, I thought we were looking at the possibility of adding a condition that would be specific to a tension home. So if that's the case, and there was a tenant change, that would require a new use review. That has been done on other types of uses like restaurants, if it was found that was necessary to meet the criteria like Hella was talking about.
Okay, thank you.
So just a quick status check. We've been at it for a little more than 2 hours. Do we want to keep going forward with the, we have the restaurant and the ELU greater than 20% issue, and then push through, or do folks want to take a break somewhere along the way?
Take 5.
Take 5 now or take 5?
It's been a couple hours.
Okay. Why don't we take a 5-minute break? Let's make it a strictly 5-minute break, and then we'll push through.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
We were slow. Doing it.
to order to resume the deliberations of the planning board. And I think the next item that we need to address is the use review for the restaurant use in the RH2 zone. Staff has made a recommendation that we approve that based on the analysis of the use review criteria in staff's memorandum and the supporting materials. Does anybody disagree with staff's proposal that we, or recommendation that we approve that use?
Nope.
Liz?
Yeah, I don't support that use, actually. We've heard so much public testimony from the neighborhood about this particular aspect of the project, and they did not support it. And I think that testimony is evidence of the incompatibility of it, which is one of the key criteria for the use review. There are so many restaurants nearby, and residents can hopefully obtain employment and training at other restaurants, and hopefully they're also looking at other businesses and not just restaurants, so that the residents who are not inclined to become restaurant workers, might become whatever, graphic designers or whatever other kinds of professions that occupy a lot of the spaces nearby. And this is really the residential side and separated from Pearl Street and all of those restaurants and activities. And this seems like kind of an incursion into the neighborhood to bring this restaurant in. And I was thinking that like co-housing and co-op living, you could still have that beautiful corner, which I think is really nicely done, and have it be internal to the function of the attention homes, where they, in sort of a communal way, learn how to cooperatively run a food service kind of situation for each other. So I wouldn't suggest getting rid of the space or not have kitchen facilities and that kind of thing, but not make it a public restaurant. And again, this is another one where I think maybe after a few years and everything's kind of settled down and the neighborhood is more comfortable with what's going on there, then they could come back and apply for a use review for a restaurant there and get an approval then. But I think this is one where we heard so much feedback and testimony from the neighborhood that we have to consider that, and most of that testimony was about the incompatibility of it. So that's where I stand.
Other additional reasons, thoughts, disagreement? Crystal?
Turn on my mic here. I mean, I agree totally with Liz. I'm not going to repeat everything that she said, but one thing we learned at the last hearing was the contract is basically for the restaurant is basically between Gardner Capital and the restaurateur. And if they're going to have a relationship with Attention Homes, then I read the information that said Attention Homes had certain criteria. But it makes it less of a conforming type of site. Plus, once you get a restaurant in, it doesn't necessarily have to stay a social enterprise, because that's not one of our criteria. And I don't believe we can condition it on the attachment to Attention Homes. And I already said there's so many opportunities downtown that and even at Bridge House, that there's other opportunities in town to get training, and hopefully the downtown might step up with some internship programs.
Other thoughts on this one? David?
I am, sympathetic to the need for, nonprofits to look at ways to do a social enterprise, because it does really help you get your books to balance out at the end of the year. And when you have an opportunity, it is attractive to, to pursue it. So I understand, the desire to do it. I don't really see that it's going to be that incompatible to have a little takeaway shop on that corner. But I can see how maybe some would be of the opinion that it's just too much with everything else in the package. I guess I'd be interested in hearing other opinions. But it is a nice kind of package to have it on your site when you're looking to be able to bring in a little extra revenue, and it has the advantage of being able to train your folks as well.
And I'll call on myself really briefly to say, I think with Lucille's already on the block, a great deal of activity within the neighborhood and an overarching interest of the city to encourage more walkable and mixed uses. And given the very small size of the restaurant, I really don't see the incompatibility and see it as mostly the benefit both in this particular area and long-term for the neighborhood. And while there were certainly, I think, some folks in the neighborhood who are very concerned about it, I was not convinced by the suggestion that it would become a major hangout for, people who would cause major problems for the neighborhood. I think they're more likely to be people in the neighborhood and professional workers downtown using it, given the cost and value of the real estate. I just don't see the likelihood of those spillover effects. So, Brian?
Yeah, I'm glad you went first because you said what I was going to say, but much more eloquently. And I do think, I'll only add that we spend a lot of our time on this board trying to work in mixes of uses into this sort of history of Euclidean zoning where we've got these big monolithic uses. And, I think, I wouldn't really make the argument that they have to have this space to make the neighborhood walkable because you can walk other places. But I think it is compatible, and I don't think, little cafes and restaurants are shown to be problematic in neighborhoods. So I think it's a very good thing to do. Plus, with the program that's applied to it, I think it's a really good idea. So.
Peter?
I agree with the compatibility, and it's underscored by the statement that there's so many things within walking distance, which further points out that this is an urban environment and not a suburban neighborhood. So the hours would be, remind me again of the hours of the restaurant or cafe. Is that,
7 a.m. to 6 p.m.
That's great.
yeah, I think it would be an asset to the neighborhood, and if it assists in any way with achieving its goal of transitional housing, that's great.
Any other thoughts?
Just that I do think that in an ideal world, it will be an interface between the residents of the project and the residents of the neighborhood.
And the city, the residents of the entire city.
Yeah, it's really useful in normalizing people who are having a hard time to be treated as if they're part of a functional system.
And everyone should work at a restaurant.
I will note, just to, like with Crystal, we are going in with our eyes open that we can't guarantee that, and it could be any variation of a restaurant use that meets with the management plan and the conditions of approval. So we don't have guarantee it will be a social enterprise. So, Crystal?
I mean, that's one concern. The other concern is with our use reviews, with the professional offices, the restaurant, it starts eroding into the residential area. All these neighborhoods, whether it's the Hill or Goss Grove or Whittier, you take a 5-minute walk and you tell me how many restaurants you can bump into. A lot. And coffee shops. And this is going to be a grab and go. It's not going to be a go to Boxcar and open up your computer or meet some friends and stuff like that. It's going to be like Organic Sandwich Company, which is, I don't know if it's going to be like that, but it's not set up to be a cafe where people hang out. Based on the parking that you've estimated, there's only going to be, 9 seats?
All we know now is it'll be like Black Belly Light, right?
Maybe. We don't even know that for
But
sure.
we know that Hosea is the operator to start with, right?
Well, we can't guarantee that. They have a letter of intent, but that may fall through, so.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest part of all this is that we don't know what will happen. In theory, it sounds great
Well-
that there's this bucolic little neighborhood joint that we can all walk to and see our neighbors and interact with this phenomenal idea that we're going to transition folks
I mean,
back
in
to
the,
us.
you know, in the perfect world, I'd be happy with transitional housing and the support that they need, and maybe transitional family housing where the professional offices and the corner restaurant takes up. But that's not our call. I'm just saying, when you look at erosion into a residential district, those are some of the things that are possibilities in the future that you've given up.
I have an idea,
So-
Crystal. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
What Harmon said, the way it normalizes it, I mean, it does make it more accessible to everyone. Otherwise, it becomes something of a, almost like an inpatient hospital environment where people walk around it. And this is a place to walk into it and to be a part of it. And that permeable membrane, I think, is really important. If this was a bar that was going to be open late, yes, I would agree with you. Something that's going to close at 6, well before sunset on most nights of the summer. And we as a community and everyone here who enjoys coming before us I think we'll police ourselves. I think we'll, again, the process, the market will dictate what's there. Like you said, it's high dollar rent. It'll become an amenity, or it won't work. And if it doesn't work, it won't pay its rent. If it won't pay its rent, it won't be there. And the only way it'll pay its rent is if people buy stuff from it. And the people who buy stuff from it are the people who live there and around it. And if we don't shop there, it won't exist. So therefore, in this case, the only thing that will survive is something that's of use to the neighborhood. No one's going to charitably support something.
So,
Well,
so just secondly,
yeah.
I think we'll have a disagreement. We could go on this for a while. But if there are new additional thoughts, pro or con, let's get them out on the table. And
here's-
Crystal, you get the first crack
Here's
at
my
it.
additional thought is, at the concept review, I actually said the old detention homes, which was right down the street, had a big, wonderful porch. I live in the neighborhood. I walked by. I got to know some of the residents because they're on their porch just like everybody else is in their neighborhood. You are on your porch. You get to know people. And I'm think that these residents, rather than being in this, you know, whatever you said, or kind of a cloistered environment, they're going to read they're going to join the next door Whittier when someone says, hey, I need some yard work or this or that. They're going to be just like, hopefully the rest of the younger people in the neighborhood. And I think that that's your goal, is to get people on a great path in life. And so I might push back a little bit about it's going to be cloistered and separate. And we don't, in reading the packet, you don't even know if there are going to be any residents working there. There was an alternative to do a contribution. You know, the goal would be to have the place staffed by all the residents because they became so proficient in restaurateuring. But there's nothing in writing, and there's nothing we could put in our site review criteria.
I know we're moving off this, but even if it wasn't staffed by anyone there, the physical act of you entering off the sidewalk into the property is in and of itself a move towards integration. I know you live there, it's your neighborhood, it's not mine, so.
Well, it
Dave-
could be applied to anybody.
David, actually,
I'll just, I think that with the conditions, I just want to, I understand that, yes, we are saying that a commercial, this is for commercial use, but it is still limited to the conditions. So I just want to keep that in mind. So if it did not stay a social enterprise, what we would be able to see is something else with 9 interior seats from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. With no outdoor speakers. And that's probably not going to be something really terrible. And also, I assume that it would, there would be a financial arrangement with the property and everything. So I don't know that it would be like a dramatic thing if that happened. We all hope that the social enterprise thing would go through, but obviously we don't have any direct control over that.
And I think we have to assume it won't be for purposes of making our decision on that because we can't guarantee it for the long run. So, so with that, why don't we move to the last use review topic, which is a very technical one, but it's still important one, which is we have to approve a use if it's more than 20% efficiency living units or ELUs. Staff has recommended, based on the overall proposal, that we grant this use review. Does anybody disagree with that one? Not seeing any, then why don't we move on from that? I think the last item that we need to address before, I think, entertaining a motion or motions is the solar access exception. Again, based on the way that the applicant is proposing to redraw some of the lot lines, there are some shadows that could be cast on some of those buildings that would trigger this area. Staff has recommended that we find an exception to that rule based on the reasons in the packet. Does anyone disagree with staff's reasoning on that issue?
I'm fine with it.
Okay, so hearing none, I think we're at a stage right now where we can move to actual resolution and nail down a decision and conditions. I spoke briefly with Hella about whether it would make sense to have one omnibus motion or separate motions, and I think part of that may depend on whether whoever's moving is proposing to approve it all or approve some but disapprove others. So you could approve the site review, for example, but disagree with one or more of the uses, and that might be better with a separate motion. Hella or Carl, any additional thoughts on that? Guidance for the board on how to move forward? And I've tried to keep track of a number of the conditions that it sounds like there's some agreement about, and a couple that I think we're just going to have to vote on because they remain contentious.
Yeah.
So, Hella, Carl, any final word, and then I'll get back to you, Harmon.
Yeah, that's fine.
No? Okay.
No, I just, sometimes we have draft the conditions by putting them up on a screen if you're drafting conditions, so I think that might be a good idea in this case.
Okay, that sounds good. Harmon, did you have a?
I was just going to suggest that if you're the only one who's kept all of the proposed conditions, that you would make the motion, or I could make a motion with a couple of the conditions that I have and then accept friendlies or entertain friendlies.
Sure. Do you want to go ahead?
Just as a quick reminder, the ones that are underlined are the ones that the applicant has indicated they're not in agreement with.
That's helpful. Thanks.
That is good. I'm actually happy to make a motion here, and then people can, and I'll try to stick with the things that I think we have at least agreement on conditions, maybe not on use review issues, and then folks can propose amendments. Can we go back to that language slide? So I'll make a motion to approve site review application number LUR 2017-00007 and use review application number LUR 2017-00008, incorporating the staff memorandum and the attached site review checklist as findings of fact subject to the conditions of approval as amended as follows. And now if we could put up a screen.
Just as a clarification, it's actually 2017 6 and 7. I apologize for that.
Okay, so I'll amend it to
on the
include
slide.
6 and 7.
You just want a screen to type.
Yeah, just have a screen to capture additional changes.
With this thing?
think I can't put it in. I don't have the right outlet.
Do you need an HDMI? Do you need an HDMI? Okay, I've got several.
I need one of those. So I started to draft some language just based on what you guys were talking about. I don't know if it actually captures that, but I started to draft it in purple.
That sounds,
Can you read that now?
If you just click on page width, it'll get a little wider.
so on the first one there, I think definitely we wanted the site plans to include bathrooms in the restaurant for the new building, meeting building code requirements. And then on the other one, I think the recommendation was just to refer it to DAB.
Well, and I think the decision authority would be the city manager. So
Okay.
I try to create a condition that they have to meet, and then the next one down below does a DAB referral,
Okay.
because DAB is only a advisory board.
Super tiny thing. I don't know if it's plural restrooms, because with that occupancy size, it might only be a single shared gender one.
About bathroom facilities.
Or
Restroom.
bathroom,
Washroom.
I like facilities, that's a good one, that's a good, and it could be anything.
Put facilities for now. And
yeah. So where the ... is, we had talked about reviewing the gable as well, the facade.
how about the refinement of the facade and porch facing Pine Street?
Well, it's just of that one segment, though. It's not of the entire facade facing Pine
It's
Street.
the entry feature facade.
The gable and porch portion.
Yeah,
Okay.
the gable and porch portion of the facade, would that work?
Elements.
Porch.
And I had put in ... because I wasn't sure what the goal of the changes was. How do you want it refined?
Well, I think Harmon and I both talked about it being more compatible with the surrounding architecture or the neighborhood architecture or something like that.
I think that's a fair characterization.
But we said gables are, we said there are gables on the block, so.
Yeah,
I think it's taking another look at it. It's not saying we'd have to get rid of, or they would need to get rid of, but they'll need to go talk to DAB about cleaning that up, and then the city manager will make the final decision.
And was it about the proportion of
I was
the
gonna
porch and the span?
Yeah, I don't think it's actually about compatibility. I think it's about the composition and proportions of it.
Okay, that helps a
It's
lot.
not
Well,
compatibility.
For me, I
that's
mean,
the main-
I don't know about, but for me, the compatibility was an issue.
But I think it was the proportions that was
Well,
part
the
of the
fact that it
compatibility issue.
spanned, two separate, what were
Buildings.
supposed to look like two separate buildings.
I agree with Liz.
Well, I think that's less about compatibility and more about composition and proportions.
I think,
They both work.
since I'm making the motion, I'm going to grab from both of you and say composition and compatibility.
Sounds great.
And that'll be something that I think DAB will have the benefit of our discussion, can take advantage of the expertise, and the city manager can make the final call on that.
so composition and compatibility of the gable and porch portion of the facade.
Yeah. Gable and.
And we need composition and compatibility above.
Well, I like what she's got there, but where it says.
Right now, I wrote it as refinement of the composition of the gable and porch portion to be more compatible with the
I think that works.
Oh, you sure? You're the motion maker.
I'm the motion maker, so it works for me and people can amend. And then I think we also need to include a provision for at least one EV charging station.
I just say
Which I think-
EV charging stations to the current building code, older building code.
But I think that's the new building code. This project would still be subject to the
That's the
old
old
building
one.
code as having a site review pending at the time of the
Yeah,
adoption.
exactly true. What I specifically meant to say is that it would be the current building code. So the EV charging station count would be based on the current building code, not the applicable building code to this project. If that makes sense.
Yes.
So Brian, how many charging stations do you're saying let them
I don't have
do
that committed to memory. I don't
Okay.
know. I mean, it's a
That's okay.
proportion of the
Proportion,
total
right.
and, yeah. That's why I'm saying meet the code instead of coming up with a number.
Okay.
Current.
And then when you're done there, we can scroll down and take a look.
Current ordinance.
I'm going to try to find that ordinance number
Yeah, we can
after
fill that
we
one
can,
in.
yeah.
And then want to scroll down and see.
We could take a break after we do this to
Just make sure it's there.
polish it up
Yeah.
before we vote too.
Was it Lucille's resolution? Did we get that in there or not?
I think we're fine with it since the
Yeah.
existing and
Talk to
current
him,
shed.
talk
Yeah,
into the
that
mic.
one's already taken
Shed,
care of.
there's going to be shed, got it.
I think the existing and future sheds are both shown.
Is it add compliance?
Ensure.
Ensure or maximize or?
Ordinance 8166.
Okay, good change. So, and I would leave it off at that and leave others to make amendments related to parking. So that would be my motion.
Did we lose bathrooms?
What's that?
Did we lose bathrooms? in the
No,
mix?
because we're not sending that to DAB.
Okay.
DAB doesn't need to worry about
Got it.
interior bathrooms. So, what's that? So, so that's my motion. There's some language there about parking, which would not be part of my motion at this point, but if others want to include that or sponsor that, but let's at least get mine out there and get a second on it, and then figure out where to go from there.
I'll second it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Liz. So we have a motion by Putnam, seconded by Payton. So now we can look at any possible amendments that folks would like to offer. Should we give you a second to catch up there?
Oh, did they just talk to me? What was the ordinance number?
8166. The data was
So I think that's it. Helen, I don't know if we want to just highlight the portion down below that's not part of my motion on the parking. For now, my motion doesn't change staff's proposal on parking.
Okay.
David?
Are you looking for a proposal for parking at this point? Would this be the time to put that forth?
I think now is the time to propose amendments, including on parking or anything else, including the applicant also had some questions about pieces that they were concerned about, and if anyone wants to offer those or anything else, now's the time.
Well, I had one thought after we all kind of deliberated on the parking thing. What I thought we could change the wording to support the staff recommendation that 23 leased spaces be provided, assuming that all other spaces are signed and assigned. However, if the applicant were able to come up with a management approach by which, say, 66% of the 82 spaces could truly be shared parking among the users, that they could potentially go up to 30, as many as 32 leased spaces, if they could come up with something like that. And that would kind of give them the opportunity to think creatively about how they might be able to move towards shared spaces. So something like that came to mind. If people are interested in entertaining such a, kind of a loose condition, or I guess a mapped out condition.
And just to understand how that might work, is that something, and I'm looking to Hella and staff too, just to think about how that would be structured, that the city manager would have to make some sort of finding that it was adequate, or is it just a trigger that when they present some sort of plan on that front that meets the 66 or whatever % criteria, or 66 spots?
Yeah, and let me just be a little bit more explicit what I envision. I would say that in the 33% would be maybe the existing residential people who are used to parking next to their residences, maybe some of the other, like the existing Lucille's spots, and maybe some of the other existing businesses. As long as it added up to less than, say, 20, 21 spaces, you'd still have 40 spaces to work with the shared, and that could include the leased. And if that worked out and you got agreement with your users and it made sense from a business case for leasing, maybe they would just decide that's the way to go. And I think both options could be on the table.
Could we stipulate that happens through a minor mod or some specific city process that you guys can just use?
I mean, it could be structured to be part of TechDoc. It could be structured to be a minor mod. It just sounds to me that they've already submitted a lot of documentation that supports their perspective that the parking on the site could be unsigned and not as allocated as staff is proposing and get to the 33. So we've already kind of evaluated that and came to this conclusion. So I'm not sure what additional information they might provide to convince staff that 33 is the number. I guess I'm trying to understand.
Well, they wouldn't be able to assign the leased spaces in this proposal, I don't think. They'd have to allow, the leasers would have, the people who are leasing spaces would have to come and get them on a first come, first served basis. There wouldn't be a number 33 assigned to one of the leasers, for example.
But are you suggesting that that if something alternative comes in, that they could potentially go up to 33 spaces though, correct?
That's right. If they could justify that arrangement. But it would mean that, the lion's share of the spaces would not be able to be assigned to specific uses on the site. That only, maybe up to a third of them could.
I mean, obviously, I think it's up to the board about, how much flexibility they want to give. I think in this case, we have the staff proposed condition with specific allocated parking in 23 leased spaces, or alternatively, no allocation of specific spaces and shared parking for the entire site and 33 leased spaces. I don't know if a condition can show two options. I think we'd have to know exactly what the board would like us to review to get to the 33 leased spaces.
Well, maybe the way to say it is actually that we don't want to have the parking signed kind of in any case. And if they come back, if they do that, and then on reconsidering that part, staff is willing to go to 33, then maybe that's up to staff. 'Cause I think the thing, I mean, the windmill I'd prefer to tilt at here for sure is really, like, why is the city asking us to violate the shared unbundled, managed and paid principles that we are advocating people do? So I don't really like that. And I think if that goes away, then the 33 is, to me, it's a different question.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thanks, John. I think, putting words in staff's mouth, the concern is that if we don't have enough dedicated spaces for the on-site uses, then the sub-principles might not protect the neighborhood adequately.
Bingo.
And so I'm going to suggest that we either bite the bullet and just go for a motion which would allow for 33 unbundled shared parking spaces, period, as a condition of approval in, contravention of the staff recommendation, or that we do more of a, play it as it goes and see how it works out condition, which says we're going with the staff recommendation now, which staff believes will serve adequately the needs of the community in terms of parking. But unlike, anyone else who gets to come back in for a modification of their site review, if they want to, we're going to give this particular applicant a condition which specifically invites them to come back in for a modification of their site review if they can show through a parking analysis after the project is built and operational that they still have available parking. And that way, when they come in front of us next year or 2 years from now or 3 years from now, they can say, we've built this project, we occupied this building, and we still have 15 empty spots. We've tried this for 3 months, and we'd like to be able to lease some more spaces and generate some revenue. So to me, I'm not prepared to make a motion right now. I wanted to put those two options out on the table.
And can I ask staff about maybe a variant on Harmon's piece, which is if the staff did bite, or if the board bit the bullet and wanted to go for the higher number, is it possible to make the 10 extra spaces conditional on not having spillover into the community in the future, such that if that were ever demonstrated, that condition would be breached and you go back?
I mean, the board could propose that and it could be added as a condition. It just would be difficult for us to assess and monitor. I mean, that's effectively why we didn't recommend the 33 spaces, because it gets into some territory where it's very difficult for us to say, this is where this person parked.
So other thoughts? I mean, I'll say I think I agree with Harmon that there's a conflicting city principles here between the sump principles and wanting to encourage that principle, and then being conservative about spillover traffic and neighborhood protection. And maybe we just have to choose between them and go one direction or the other.
So if the sump principle is not a site review criteria,
It's not a site review criteria,
it's an
but
aspiration and it's a principle and a goal. And we should probably put that on our list of things that we want to talk about. So we haven't required that of other projects except at Boulder Junction. That's the only place.
actually, we've talked about it, I think, at a number of other
But we haven't made it a
properties.
condition.
I
We've
think
made it a
we've,
condition, but they've often justified a parking reduction based on that.
Well, I mean, if you look at the review criteria for parking, the design of the parking areas makes efficient use of land and uses the minimum amount of land necessary to meet the parking needs. That's an underlying principle in SUMP. I think we can get close enough to shared unbundled, managed, paid with the conditions that we have.
But can you guarantee it's going to have, another criteria for use review is that it be a compatible transition between higher intensity and lower intensity, and we're already raising the intensity and giving a huge parking reduction, and then trying something that we're not even sure how it's going to work on this property, because I imagine the church would like to have some sign property some sign spaces over by their office.
Well,
I'm just guessing, and I'm guessing some of the other uses might too.
I think that's the problem.
Yeah.
So we have a motion on the table right now, which is basically leave it at staff's proposal and the proposed conditions of use. Does anyone want to make an alternative motion at this point? Otherwise, we ought to take a look at some of the other provisions.
I'll make it friendly that we adopt the staff proposal or the staff condition regarding parking with the caveat that we're inviting the applicant to come forward as early as 6 months after they achieve their certificate of occupancy to request a modification to allow for unbundled parking and additional leasing of spaces.
And I guess I'm going to ask Hella about that aren't the underlying requirements about their amendment something that's in the code, and can we change that through our conditions?
I'm not asking to change it. I'm just saying that when they come forward, there's going to be evidence in the record, not evidence that you have to search through minutes to find, but evidence in their actual use review and site review approval that says that staff recognizes that there may be additional parking demand that's not being met by this program, and the applicant can come forward with a different program, but they need to provide, I don't know if it's 6 months is the right number, but some time series data, and I'd like to let them come in as soon as feasibly possible.
So is maybe the condition that they collect the data to support that? Because otherwise, I think that's more of an invitation than a condition. And I'm not sure we can or should do that, but collecting data, we certainly can have them do.
Okay.
Of course, it's in their self-interest to do it anyways.
But I still think
And
we want
amend
to ask
the-
the applicant if they want to put themselves on the hook for doing another parking study, even if we're assuming it's in their self-interest, but that would be something I'd want to hear from them on.
And amend, have them amend the Fox Tuttle or get Fox Tuttle to do a survey surrounding the area to see if that condition has changed.
So at this point, I don't think I'd take it as a friendly, just because I think they have the mechanism to seek this in the future. They can cite this record for that, and I guess I wouldn't create new burdens or requirements on that. And if they can prove it up, and there's a generalized interest in doing that through a sophisticated sump that will demonstrably not affect the community, then they can make that showing, based on some of the evidence that they're able to collect once they're actually implementing this project. David?
Can I offer maybe an alternative friendly that would maybe try to get at this, but would say that it's the preference of the planning board to move further towards some principles. We understand that this may not be the optimal solution. However, it's the only solution we've seen that has been fully fleshed out. So we would encourage the applicant to, in the future, come back once they have more data, to have a more creative way to maybe get more leased space once they know how these spaces are going to be used, something like that.
See, I think, to me, that would be a
We're just
separate
encouraging them.
resolution or motion or something. I don't think it's a condition
It's not a really condition, is it?
that we
But it's a
could
good-
put in. But
It sounds to me like what you're proposing is to inviting the applicant to come in once they have collected data that shows, 33 parking spaces would be possible with the plan they're proposing. I think in that case, the applicant has the option of filing an application to amend the use review application. I wouldn't condition that on this approval.
So is it enough to have it reflected in the minutes today? Is that what
We
we?
can have a resolution.
We
we
could
could
have,
do a resolution after the main motion.
Okay.
If people are interested in doing that. It doesn't bind anybody to anything, but it's at least something on the record that people can point to that there may be support from
but
the board.
I wanted to work hard on this, and I do think that it is not up to us in this forum to waste everybody's time trying to come up with the exact solution. So I think that's the right way to go. So I support doing a resolution and not a condition.
Any other?
Okay, so at this point, there's no friendly on the table.
there's no friendly, we still have the base motion, which doesn't include anything different about parking than what's in staff's proposal or on TDM or anything else. So with that, any other recommended amendments,
To parking?
including on anything?
On anything.
Site review, use review?
Nope.
Any final discussion, one way or the other? Crystal?
Okay, under the use review, I'm going to move that the restaurant use be denied. I think, is that the proper?
I think you want to amend my motion to remove.
Oh, I'm sorry. I want to amend the motion to remove the restaurant use in the new building located at 1440 Pine because it does not meet the criteria in 9-2-15E, specifically under E2, under the rationale. It doesn't provide a compatible transition between higher intensities and lower intensity uses. In fact, it does just the opposite.
And I won't take that as a friendly, unsurprisingly, but is there a second for that?
I'll second that.
Seconded by Liz Payton.
So we vote on the, on
We'll
her-
vote on the amendment
Okay.
before we go to the main motion.
Okay.
Is there any discussion of that or amendment to the amendment?
I think we had a pretty robust discussion
I think we
before.
did. So why don't we call that question, all those on the planning board in support of the motion by Crystal Gray, seconded by Liz Payton, to amend the main motion to deny the proposed new restaurant use for the reasons identified. Please signify by raising your hand and saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Nay.
That amendment fails, the motion fails by 2 to 5. Any other amendments,
Okay.
discussion?
I'm going to move that we remove, I'm going to move an amendment to your motion, John, to remove the professional office use in the new building at 1440 Pine Street, except for the uses that directly support the transitional housing as provided in the transitional housing definition. Supportive services, I believe the definition says.
And that one also is not a friendly, so
It's not a friendly,
is there a
and it
second?
doesn't meet the criteria for review, in my opinion.
Okay. Is there a second for that?
So just to be clear on what the motion is, it's to deny the professional office space uses for anything that's not Attention Homes office uses, is that right?
No, that's not, that's not, supports transitional housing as the use, as the supportive services uses are defined.
And this is different than the staff that are on site to handle the facilities.
This is for the use review, so it would be in shorthand for the 9 and not the 3.
Right.
So is there a second for that motion?
Well, hang on a second. Oh, no, go ahead, Cindy.
If there's not a second, that will fail for lack of a second. And it appears there's no second. So that motion fails. Other recommendations on amendments? Hearing none, I think we're ready to call this package as a whole. Staff, do you want to take a minute or two just to make sure we've got it all? Or are you pretty comfortable?
Did the board want to discuss some of the conditions that the applicant had concerns about, or?
Do you want to put those up, and
Not parking again.
that's our last,
There's some other ones.
what's that?
I said not the parking ones that they wanted.
Why don't we put them up on the screen just in the interest of fairness? If people want to make that amendment, they can. If not, we'll move on.
Yeah, they're related to the number of years that eco-passes will be provided and things like that. I think the current language is kind of in perpetuity.
Right.
And they wanted to put a time limit on it, I think. And also it reduces the number of people who would get eco-passes, I think.
Right.
In various ways. Do you have that language?
I'd have to plug into the.
I know we're probably overly multitasking here.
Oh,
Yeah.
Cindy, can you try to get that up there? Do I need to?
Is on 3 and 4? There you go. It's kind of.
So the board's already discussed the 23 parking spaces. It's really the eco-pass and transportation fund requirements.
Is there anyone who'd like to make any motion related to any of these issues? Seeing none, last call for any amendments at all? Then we'll move the main motion as I think unamended that I had proposed and was seconded by Liz Payton. All in favor of that motion?
Wait, are we going to have a discussion? A brief discussion? Can we make some?
I provided the opportunity, but if there's something you want to say now, please go ahead.
Okay, so we're voting on the motion right now.
The big enchilada,
What
yes.
what I just want to say is, and I'm so glad Peter kicked off by asking about the process of, getting the grants approved and how that, and not to put words in your mouth, but in my mouth, is how that feeds into an open and transparent public process. And unfortunately, exactly what we're voting on, besides a little bit what the building looks like, is what was put in that grant package before the concept review and before this board even got to hear the public and before the applicants even got to hear our concerns. And to me, that is really troubling. And it happened on Palo Park the exact same way. So when the community asked, why can't we embrace supportive housing for 18 to 24-year-old homeless youth? Why can't we support permanently affordable housing at Palo Park for families? But when you don't involve people in a transparent and honest process, that's what's going to happen. We're going to have winners and losers, and we have to change that. And I'm sorry, I got distracted by you guys. But we really have to change that in the community if we're going to move forward and meet our goals in our camp plan and serving different members of the community. And I'd like it to be a process where people embrace the project and they feel part of it. But this process doesn't allow that. And it's troubling. It's troubling for a lot of people, and to be characterized that it's either empathy or apathy. We heard that at the first hearing, and that really was troubling. So I hope that all of you, whether you were on the approving or wanted to have things changed a bit, I hope that you'll give your input to City Council as they look at a new public process and public participation method. And I think they're on the right track. And after this hearing, I am going to write my comments about how we can change this, I don't want to say rut, but this bad path we're on. So I'm kind of making a plea for all of you to join me. I mean, I would vote for this project if it didn't have so much office, and it didn't, that can be used for any type of an office use, and if it didn't have the restaurant use, I would definitely, I'd vote for the 40 units and the supportive service, but I'm not willing to vote for something that makes it so uncompatible, because I think that's asking a lot, but I think that could work. So I'm in a position where I'm going to vote no.
Hey, John?
Are there any other comments, Brian?
Yeah, that, Crystal gave me enough space to come up with a different friendly amendment. If it's,
Okay.
if you're willing to entertain.
I haven't completed calling the question, so go
Yeah,
ahead.
well, we're going to interrupt you until that goes to midnight. So I think I'd like to add language that the signage required for the parking provided for each user under item 13 allow for time of use based sharing. Which would say, so you have office, your office space is yours exclusively from during office hours. Your restaurant space is, allowed for you to use it during restaurant hours. So it's not going to sit there empty forever.
And you're not
Didn't they have
recommending
something?
changing
I'm not-
any of the numbers in terms of the number that could be leased or anything? It's just allowing flexibility on that.
I really think it's going to make it work better.
Yeah,
I'd accept that as a friendly Liz.
Yeah, I would second.
I love that.
Actually, Liz is
are
the
we
seconder,
discussing-
so she needs to weigh in.
So I want to know before I accept that, is that consistent? How does staff respond to that suggestion?
For the signage, I think we could add it. Yeah.
Okay.
But excuse me, I thought that that's what one of their charts they show, or somewhere they said the spaces are not going to be reserved for that specific use. I thought that was already in the management that they had proposed.
Yeah, but it's
But
not in the
staff changed
staff's,
it.
it's not in the staff's language, so staff changed it away from being that.
Okay, it was somewhere in one of these.
Okay.
That's great. No empty parking spaces unnecessarily after business hours.
Right.
So I
That's
think
awesome.
you're
Yeah, that's
comfortable with that?
Yeah.
So that's accepted as a friendly amendment?
Okay. Can I just say one
Liz?
thing about that?
Yeah, the big picture.
And that is that after we vote, if we could spend a couple of minutes, that maybe we could come up with a resolution about this density, what people were calling density transfer, but just some kind of resolution to ask council to clarify it, and so that everybody sort of has a sense of what's possible and what's not possible, and it doesn't feel so much like a loophole. So,
Sure, and we'll definitely come back to that. And just one note about the record, it was accepted by Jay Putnam and L. Payton as the seconder. Any other? I just want to make one quick response to Crystal, and I agree with you that we need to improve the process. I think I would strongly disagree with the suggestion that what happened wasn't transparent or honest. I think they were following the rules and requirements as laid out, and there are no city requirements that you go to the public or the city before asking for grant money from the feds or the state. And maybe we ought to change that, and we made a suggestion on the comp plan that we do that. But I also think it's important to recognize the limits of that. We're not going to reach community consensus on every one of these issues. I think if we had had more process at Palo Park, if we had had more process here, I think a lot of the same concerns would have been there, and I think there would have been an interest in some part of the community and having as much of this transitional housing as possible, and some that would say, let's keep it to a very small amount and have it somewhere else. And we have to recognize at some point there's a limit to process. These grants are competitive, and we will lose out to other communities on that front. And so those are important policy issues that I think we need to work out. Ultimately doesn't affect how I'll vote on this matter. But I think, want to flag that this was not a place where they were violating any requirements of the city or anything else like that. It's the city's process. They followed that process. I think they did so in a fair way.
But may I just say one thing? I think when this comes up, and it's come up twice since I've been on planning board, if the applicant said, we've submitted a grant, we're not going to change anything, then people would know where they stand. That's my point. And I'm honestly, the attention homes are not developers. The church is not a developer, but Gardner Development is a developer. And so I would have liked to have been sitting here with people from all surrounding the neighborhood saying, boy, this is really great. They listen to us. We understand this. We, et cetera. So that's being, by having the process locked in, if we're going to go forward, at least say that to people. So this is what we're doing, and we're not going to change these certain things.
And I think I heard that at the concept plan level, that a lot of this was driven by their application and by the economics of the project, and they take the risk that we don't like it and we'll say no, and their project goes down in flames. So I think it behooves them to go to the public and engage as much as possible and seek as much consensus as is possible. I think it behooves the city to improve the process on that, but I do think there are limits, and I think we heard a number of comments that said the reason they didn't feel engaged is because they didn't get all the changes that they wanted, and that's just not the way that the system
I
works.
don't think that people said that. I mean, that we didn't get all the changes we wanted.
I think there were a number that said because it wasn't dropped back to a much lower number, that was the result of the failure.
Hey, I was willing to vote for it at the higher number.
Can I say something?
But not with all the uses. So, but anyway, I'm sure we can have a debrief at some other time.
Yeah, and we should.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm still not clear what they were initially committed to. I mean, I know the number of units they were locked into 40, but were they locked into the professional offices? Were they locked into the restaurant? I still don't know if that was part of their grant application or whatever. So I just wanted to make that point, because we don't, and maybe there was flexibility on that, and I don't know. So, but I do think that the neighborhood probably, it was a public process failure, I think, and I agree with Crystal on that, and I feel bad for the neighborhood for that, but I do think it's a good project, so I'm going to support the motion.
And we clearly should learn from it, and we've suggested to council further changes to learn from it. So any last amendments or comments? If not, I'm going to call the question right now. All those in favor of the motion by myself, seconded by Liz Payton, please signify by saying aye and raising your hand. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Aye.
That passes 6-1 with Planning Board Member Gray in opposition. And with this, I think there was interest in one or two motions. Harmon, looks like you've been thinking.
Yeah. It's a resolution that kind of reads like a resolution without all the whereases. So the resolution would read, the planning board recognizing that the staff recommendation regarding parking does not allow the applicant to provide as many leased spaces as are currently available. That the applicant has provided data showing that there currently is additional parking available for leasing, and that the completed project will also potentially result in additional parking being available for leasing over and above the number of spaces allowed by the approval of the project. Hereby resolves that the applicant, after it has received all of its required certificates of occupancy, fully tenanted the project, and recorded at least 6 months of data to support an updated parking study, is invited to submit to the city an application for amendment of its use review approval, specifically to allow for parking that meets some principles and allows for additional leasing of spaces.
And I think there was another element folks were thinking about, resolution.
On that particular one?
Not on this particular one.
Oh, okay.
I think there was a separate issue.
Well, there was one on the density transfer or whatever it is.
Maybe we should make that one as a separate
Yeah.
one.
Right.
Is there a second for Harmon's?
I'll second.
Great.
I think that captures a lot.
Seconded by
Do you
David.
think that a year, 6 months is long enough? That doesn't even take you through a summer season or a winter season?
Yeah, I'm comfortable with it because if they're fully tenanted, that's 6 valuable months of data.
So the trigger is fully tenanted?
Trigger is received all required certificates of occupancy and is fully tenanted.
And
Or
we're not-
maybe I should change that to 95%. I don't know if you can say fully. I don't know what folks think, because fully is a number that doesn't always occur in the real world.
And this is non-regulatory
it's really not.
invitation
Yeah,
right.
anyways.
So that's why I kind of left it loose, but
Yeah.
just thinking aloud.
And so
In front of
what's-
people.
Harmon, what's the difference between this and having them be able to come in and do a
Look,
modification?
they can come in and do a mod if they want. This is to provide something to hold up when they arrive for that modification, which is going to require a public hearing saying, you asked us to do this. You recognized that you were being conservative and that you erred on the side of protecting the neighborhood. And we're here to show you that that protection is not necessarily warranted and we have another plan.
But to be clear, this is inviting the application. We're not prejudging its outcome, and it could be that they just don't make the case and it doesn't work, or it passes with flying colors.
And like you said, it's not binding. So, I'm prescribing, some principles and 6 months. And, if they want to come in 5 months and not provide the some principles, but just ask for 28 spots instead of the 23 they were allowed, they can do that.
Yeah. And I just really be interested in whether we find that there's always 6 or 7 completely unused spaces because of the way they're signed, and that you have a really creative way to do it a lot better and get a little more revenue. So why not make it a win-win if you see that? But I just don't think we've seen the details enough to know that at this point to go against the staff recommendation.
But also, I think, as you said, to make sure that the neighborhood doesn't have impact, but also to meet the needs of the tenants. That would be the most important thing.
I like it.
Any other discussion, recommendations for amendments? Seeing none, all in favor of Harmon's resolution, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
That passes 6-1 with Board Member Gray opposed. And then,
And I can send you that language.
great, thank you, Harmon. Liz, you had,
Yeah, so I'll read what I just drafted up. The planning board recommend to city council that they revisit and clarify the code provisions that allow density calculations that exclude existing non-residential development on the site. Now, I don't know if that is clear to people. You understand what I'm getting at, though?
Yeah, but there's a lot of different zones, and that plays out in a
Yeah,
lot of
you
different
wanna-
ways. I would never be able to support something like that without knowing all of the nuances of it.
Okay, so I'm not asking them to do anything, just revisit and clarify the code provisions. And,
Well, but if-
maybe there's a better way to word it.
I don't even know what the code provisions are.
Well,
Right.
Carl outlined some of the code provisions in response to the question I had asked
In this zone on this project. I mean,
yes.
I think we don't know all the questions we haven't asked yet. I mean, I think if we're going to have a discussion about this, I would rather, have the discussion and then make a motion out of knowledge.
Okay, so I'm not making a suggestion for a code change. I'm just asking council to look into how we got here and how it feels like a loophole that people couldn't, I mean, there have been plenty of emails from folks, including their lawyers and everything, about how the density, allowable density was calculated, so.
Resolution.
There it is.
So I'll agree in part that I do think at some point a code change might be helpful to provide clarity on this. I think Hella started off at the beginning of near the beginning of the 18th, saying it was not clearly prohibited, and in a number of places, I think, implied. And I think some greater specificity might be helpful in the future. I'm not sure how to put that in a resolution language right now, but I agree with the sentiment, and I think agree with Brian that this might be a good topic that we bring up kind of in its own way about how to get our arms around that, maybe as a debrief, maybe as a separate study item or something else like that, because I think it does have wide-ranging application and it's worth a conversation. I agreed with their application here, but it doesn't mean that the code is a model of clarity.
Right.
You know, with all due respect to the staff, which I try to give as much as I can, I think that the staff didn't serve itself when they answered the question that a density transfer is not something that is permitted or prohibited in code, because that makes a density that justifies the notion that a density transfer was being requested in the first place, or that a density transfer is some sort of transfer of development rights that can be requested within a site review when we're looking at a whole site. And in fact, there was no such request made. There's not an action in my judgment and my view of the code being asked for. What's happening here is that density is simply calculated over a block that is owned in single ownership in contiguous parcels, period. And residential density does not take into account existing commercial buildings where mixed use is being requested. There was this notion that there is some sort of TDR program that exists in our code that you can request is fallacious on its face. And we had, respected members of the community writing in, creating this new rubric of density transfer that exists in the code as some phantom that savvy developers can take advantage of. And there was no such thing. There is no such thing. It's simply the method of calculation. You have 1.93 acres in this project, and you are therefore allowed to request, because they are all owned in a unity of ownership and title, contiguous parcels, you are allowed to request development density that is pertinent to 1.93 acres, subtracting the existing residential development. So I'm not interested in studying this. If people think that that's a bad law, if that's, a bad way of calculating density, then let's talk about changing it. But the notion of density transfer, made up.
So I just,
Crystal and then Brian.
yeah, so it's where does it say that you can do that? And I felt like I was in a little bit of a rabbit hole chasing down the different code citations that Carl sent, and it was a very good memo, and I totally appreciate it. It went to the whole planning board on May 17th under Carl's email. But it kept looping around, and it kept referring me back to how to calculate density and a few other things, but it didn't talk about, and this is my issue, it might be a little bit different than your clarification, but when a portion of a site is totally built out, how can you transfer anything, or how can you use that as a calculation, especially if it's landmarked or above the height limit? You have nothing to, that part of the site then is totally built out. And that's kind of my issue.
I think there's
So Brian and then.
It's, do you have are you able to calculate that as part of residential if it's built out with something else? And maybe it's just the nature of this residential zone that doesn't really look like a residential zone on the Spruce Street site. It looks like more of a transitional something site zone.
So
Brian and then David.
I agree with everything you said, Harmon. I think that was really beautifully put. I do think that we're conflating two things in this conversation. One is just simply how is density calculated in zones where you're not adding up floor area or units or things and coming up with some number. So how do office and churches and things like that relate to residential units in these certain zones? I think that's a sort of totally separate question. And the other separate question is, should we be aggregating adjacent parcels under common ownership for review or not? And I think, the downside of doing it, of not doing it, is that you don't get the benefits that we do on projects like this, where we're getting a bunch of public improvements around the entire site, and I think it's really, really positive. The other thing is it allows people to subdivide sites and then, run them separately or do things where they're able to avoid site review. So I think there's a lot of reasons that we have that built in that are really positive reasons. And I know those reasons because I've asked if I could figure out a way to avoid site review about a dozen times, and these guys keep telling me no because of that. So I've been trying that. It doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because we have that rule in place. So I think we get much, much more benefit out of it than less benefit. And I really, really feel like on this project, the ability to look at the entire block as one urban design problem is extremely positive.
Sorry.
I think David's next, but before we go to David, we have a motion, we've had discussion. Do we have a second for Liz's resolution?
I'll
Okay,
second
Chris-
it if you read it again.
Well,
It's up there on the
Oh,
screen.
there it is. Okay.
Hella reworded it, Hella and Charles, I think.
Why don't you take a look at that, and then David could get his piece in, just so we keep things moving, because we could end up all night discussing this, and I really would prefer we didn't, because we should discuss
Yeah.
this in a fresh way. But David.
Well, I just very quickly in my mind, we make these kinds of trade-offs all the time where we, maybe in a less controversial site, we might put the building, a three-story building on one side so that we have lots of open space, and everybody loves that. So, it's really about site boundaries. And I agree completely with Harmon that there's really nothing with this density transfer is just something that was kind of came out of thin air. But it's really about site boundaries in my mind. And that's pretty simple to me. And we can certainly look at whether there's a better way to do site boundaries, but that's all I see it as.
So, Liz, does that capture your resolution?
Yeah, I think the way that's written is fine. But I do want to just say, the public has an expectation that their zoning is going to drive a certain level of intensity. And they see a church, a giant church, and a bunch of other buildings, and they have an assumption, which is complete common sense, that the remaining undeveloped area will fall under this particular zoning standard. And so what we've done with this is kind of pretended like those buildings weren't there. And, it's common sense. Maybe it's my common sense and my common sense is not common sense or something. But anyway, it seems to me that we need to operate in a way that doesn't look like people are taking advantage of loopholes and the lack of prohibitions and things like that. I just think it should be clarified and made, everybody knows this is what's possible at this site, or this is what's possible in your neighborhood, because this kind of blindsided a lot of people. They didn't expect that this kind of thing could happen on a site that already had so many giant buildings already, or at least one giant building and a bunch of small buildings.
So before I call on Harmon or Peter, do we have a second?
I second it.
Okay.
I would just offer, I'll offer friendly after you go.
Harmon, Peter, and then back to Crystal.
Okay. So if we were to calculate density per project instead of per common ownership on the block, the perverse result of this proposal, if it was in a different situation where the church was developed in a building the same size and already had 50 units, is that you would then look at a block that today only has the ability to put in 28 units, right, without planning board review at 3,000 square feet per unit. And it would already be at 50, 22 units over the maximum without site review. And then the new project, which would be the other 3/4 of the block, could come in and add the amount of density that's allowed, not respecting the fact that there are 50 units already there. And we could end up with 80 units on the block instead of what we're getting now, which is 47 or 27.5, depending on how you calculate them. So there's a reason why you look at unity of ownership, and there's a reason why you look at density across the block. The people who wrote the code actually thought of that. And I don't think that, folks who are saying that there's a density transfer are recognizing that if you want to stop doing that, you're also going to have to accept blocks with unbelievably supercharged development where there's already, for instance, a pre-existing building that's grandfathered and has more density that would be allowed under today's code.
Peter, then Crystal?
If Harmon's recitation is correct, that this,
It's definitely correct.
this is
Because I
correct,
said it.
then, then the fact that common sense would tell you that you couldn't put more there, even though, let's say, law says otherwise, ignorance of the law is no excuse, and to refute science with anything else is, what, creationism? I don't know. Non-evolution? I mean, it's the rules. It's there. It may not be obvious to a passerby, but if you were to dig in, you'd see that nothing untoward did happen, and all of this
No, I'm
talk
not.
of density transfer is that we are sanctioning something untoward, and I want to make sure that by not voting on this, it's clear we're not sanctioning anything untoward. We're simply supporting what's there.
I'm going to give Crystal the last lick on this because we're not going to solve this issue tonight. At most, we will have a resolution that is outside of council's current work plan anyways, and we'll probably end up having to discuss again for our council letter later this year, encouraging them to look at code changes. So, at most, we're sending a soft signal to council. So I think Crystal, and then we'll call the question.
I would actually add something on this as shown in this project and somehow qualify it to say in residential zones, because I think that that's the crux of this, is the residential zone.
Is that a friendly you accept?
That's fine, yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
As shown in these types of residential zones. So it doesn't focus on this project, but
Well,
what do you think? Well, you can put my wording in.
I mean, it just limits it, right, as opposed to keeping it.
Yeah, rather than.
Do you want to limit it?
it's fine.
I think it's been made
think it's gonna pass.
and accepted by the seconder.
I have-
I'm going to call,
I have a friendly as well.
I'll take
great.
I'll take a friendly.
Okay.
About it.
She has to accept it, though.
Yeah. No, it is to Liz, yeah, because it's her motion. I just wanted to get in front of the vote. I would like to strike the words revisit and, because I think revisit and clarify
Okay,
insinuates
Okay.
that it's
Okay.
wrong and needs to change.
okay.
Thank you.
I think that that's a good.
No, it's
No,
not clarify you want to keep in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that they clarify, but get rid of revisit
Revisit and.
Yeah,
Good one.
that
That's
they
fine.
That's all right.
clarify.
thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, that I was going to make a similar kind of recommendation that would help me
Cool. Now I can vote for it.
support.
You can vote for that.
Then I'm going to move this question all in favor of the motion by Liz, seconded by Crystal. Please say aye and raise your hand.
Aye.
All opposed? That passes 6-1.
Hey, I was the one. I'm glad
Harmon
there's
in
a
opposition.
different one.
Every once in a while, you got to do it.
And with that, unless there's
One more thing
one
about
more
this.
thing,
for the neighborhood.
Steve Jobs.
I want to encourage the neighborhood to consider becoming a historic district, because, no?
No, just.
A historic district has, I mean, the most stable neighborhoods in Boulder are historic districts. And you get another level of review, you get much more, you're much more likely to get compatible projects. And there are all kinds of benefits to the homeowners if you want to do renovations. You get tax credits, all kinds of stuff. So, and now you have, 7 more landmarks to contribute to your historic district. So I hope that the neighborhood will consider that, 'cause I think it will help them stabilize their neighborhood.
Okay. With that, I'm going to move on to the next agenda item, which is matters from the planning board, planning director, and city attorney. I'm hoping that's brief since we just met a couple days ago and we'll meet in a couple more. Any matters from the board?
Negative.
Staff?
Staff's not even
Hello?
listening to it.
Okay. Any last items on debrief or calendar check?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, John. You did a good job of
Amazing.
equally corralling all of us, from applicants to board members, and the staff was exemplary.
Thank you, Crystal.
Yeah.
Appreciate
Welcome
that.
back, Hella.
That you said.
Yeah, great work, staff.
Yeah.
Did you hear me saying the staff was exemplary? Thank you.
Make sure that's in the minutes.
Remarkable.
So,
Including Cindy with all the technical challenges tonight.
Yeah.
Okay, with that, Crystal, I'm going to give that the last word, and I'm going to adjourn tonight's meeting. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.